Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. The sky had been turning a strange shade of greenish-gray all afternoon. I had never seen clouds like that before, not even in the stormy seasons back home. We were at a quiet campground, tucked away in a low valley surrounded by tall pines and scattered oaks. The smell of wet earth mixed with pine needles hung in the air. It was one of those places that felt peaceful until the wind started to shift. We were inside the camper, my family and I, just trying to relax before dinner. The camper was old but sturdy enough for a weekend trip. It was one of those boxy models with wood paneling and curtains that still had the faded smell of years of camping trips. The dinette seats had thick cushions, and the kitchen had a small stove and a sink that never quite drained properly. Outside, the world was getting darker, but inside, everything felt oddly calm for a while. Then, the wind picked up. At first, it was just a soft rustle through the trees, but within minutes it grew into a harsh whistle that rattled the camper's thin walls. The windows trembled, and the metal roof creaked like it was about to lift off. I could see through the small windows that the sky had gone almost black, the kind of black that swallows light, not just from the clouds, but from the feeling of something heavy pressing down. The air suddenly felt thick and hard to breathe, like someone had squeezed all the air out of the valley. My heart started to pound. Not because I knew exactly what was coming, but because everything inside me screamed that this was no ordinary storm. Then came the distant screams, not from inside our camper, but from nearby. Other campers were yelling, running, and crying out in fear. I could hear some banging noises, the sound of tents being ripped apart, and something heavy hitting the ground hard. It was a noise I'll never forget. The sharp cracking of wood breaking, the tearing of fabric, and the low, terrifying howl of the wind that sounded like 1,000 voices all crying at once. We were trapped inside that small camper. The door was locked and the windows were sealed tight, but the camper shook violently as if it were a toy caught in a child's hand. Every time the wind howled louder, the walls seemed to bend inwards just a little more, and I could feel the weight of the storm pressing against us like a giant fist. The trailer's old wheels bounced on the gravel beneath, making a sickening sound when the ground was hit hard. Pieces of dirt and small rocks pelted the walls like hail. The sound was deafening, but inside, we clung to each other, our bodies pressed close because we had nowhere else to go. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and fast, mingling with the scared but quiet breathing of my family. Then, the camper suddenly lurched to one side. I could feel the floor tilt beneath my feet, as if we were on a ship caught in violent waves. My legs went numb from the pressure, and I had to hold onto the edge of the table to keep from falling over. The camper rocked and swayed like it was about to roll over, and I thought for a moment that it would crush us all flat. The glass windows shook violently, but somehow none of them shattered. The curtains fluttered wildly, and I could see the dark shapes of trees bending nearly to the ground just outside. I could hear the branches snapping, the sound sharp and close like a whip cracking near my ear. Then the camper jolted again, hard, fast, and I was thrown against the wall. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I didn't dare move much because the camper was still tilting. The screams outside were fading now, cut off suddenly by the roar of the wind, which was so loud I could barely think. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. For what felt like hours, the wind battered us without mercy, slamming the camper with unbelievable force. Inside, the air grew hotter and thick with dust. The windows, which had been so tightly shut, started to fog up from our breath and the heat, making everything look blurry and strange. I could hear the sounds of metal bending and cracking in the roof above us. Every noise a reminder that the shelter protecting us was fighting a losing battle against the storm. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise began to die down. The violent shaking slowed. The pounding on the camper walls softened to a distant tapping, then stopped. The terrifying screams outside were gone. Silence fell over the valley like a heavy blanket, thick and unnatural. For a long time, no one moved. We sat frozen, listening to the quiet that felt as loud as the storm had been. Outside, I could hear the soft drip of water falling from the leaves and the occasional creak of broken branches settling back onto the ground. When I finally dared to look out the window, the world was completely changed. Trees were uprooted, lying like fallen giants across the gravel and dirt roads. Tents were shredded rags on the ground, poles broken and scattered like matchsticks. The campsites around us were empty. No people, no cars, no sounds of life anywhere. The camper had survived, battered and bruised, but standing. We were all shaken, our faces pale, our bodies aching but alive. I slowly opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel. The air was cool and fresh, but carried a heavy smell, a mix of wet wood, dirt, and something metallic that I couldn't place at first. The silence around us was complete, broken only by the faint, distant sound of sirens far away, probably emergency crews starting to come through. We moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over fallen limbs and smashed camping gear. The ground was soaked with rain that had come after the storm's worst, and everywhere I looked, I saw signs of destruction. Crushed picnic tables, overturned grills, and crushed vehicles. I realized then how close we had come to real disaster. But we were safe. I looked back at the camper, its dented sides and cracked awning telling a story of survival. It was battered, but it had held. We had held. In that moment, as the sun began to break through the dark clouds, spilling golden light across the ruined campground, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The storm was over. The danger was past. We would rebuild. We would heal. We would remember. And life somehow would go on. I was hiking alone on a quiet trail deep in the woods. The day had started out clear and bright, with the sun shining through the tall trees and lighting up the forest floor. I had planned this trip for weeks, wanting to get away from everything and spend a day in nature by myself. The trail was narrow and winding, the dirt soft under my boots, lined with ferns and patches of moss. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and every now and then a small animal rustled through the leaves. It felt peaceful, like the whole world had slowed down just for me. I kept a steady pace, my backpack snug against my back, the weight of water, snacks, and some extra clothes reminding me that I was prepared. The air smelled fresh, with hints of pine and damp earth. Every step I took seemed to echo softly, mixed with the sounds of the forest. I stopped once to take a drink from my water bottle, sitting on a fallen log and looking around. The trees were tall and thick here, their branches tangled and full of green leaves. Sunlight filtered through, casting moving patches of light and shadow on the ground. After a while, I got back up and continued. The trail started to climb a little, winding between rocks and roots that stuck up like broken bones from the earth. My legs worked hard, and I felt my breathing deepen. As I went higher, the trees grew thinner, and the sound of the birds faded away. The forest felt quieter now, heavier, like it was holding its breath. The air grew cooler, and I noticed a faint mist starting to curl around the trunks. I stopped again, wiping sweat from my forehead, and looked around carefully. There was nothing unusual, just the empty trail stretching ahead and the soft rustling of the wind in the branches. But then, just as I was about to start walking again, I heard it, a voice calling my name. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but clear. My name, spoken slowly, with a strange, low tone that made my skin prick. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. "Hello," I said quietly, looking toward the shadowed trees off the trail. Nothing moved. No sound answered except the gentle rustling of leaves. The voice came again, closer this time. It was just behind a thick stand of pines, their dark trunks standing like silent guards. The voice didn't shout or scream. It was almost calm, almost like someone was just trying to get my attention. But I knew I was alone. I hadn't seen or heard another person all day, and the trail was remote, miles from the nearest road or camp. I spun around, looking down the path I had come from, then toward the way I was supposed to go. Nothing. No sign of anyone. My skin was cold now, and I felt a tight knot of fear coil inside me. I told myself it was probably a trick of the wind, or maybe some animal mimicking a sound. But my gut told me otherwise. I started walking faster, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to listen for the voice again. But it came. A third time, louder, closer. My name, clear and sharp, right beside me now. It was coming from the shadows between the trees. I stopped again, frozen in place. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around my feet. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I strained my eyes, trying to see into the dark underbrush. Branches and leaves moved slightly, but I still couldn't make out a figure. No footsteps, no sound except my own ragged breathing. Then I heard something else, a faint crack of a twig breaking. It was close, very close. Something was moving in the woods near me. My heart raced so fast, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone from my backpack, my hands shaking, and tried to turn on the flashlight. The screen flickered before it finally lit up, the beam cutting through the mist. I pointed the light toward the sound. The trees stood like silent watchers in the circle of light. I saw a few small animals scurry away, a squirrel, a rabbit, but no people. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just another hiker who had called my name as a joke, or someone else on the trail. I decided to keep moving, but I chose a different path, stepping off the main trail onto a smaller side path I had spotted earlier on the map. It looked like it would loop back to the main trail a little further up. I walked faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, the beam of my flashlight sweeping through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me. The mist wrapped around the trunks and stones like a living thing, thickening with every step. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot and the low whistle of the wind through the trees. And then the voice again, right behind me this time, so close it was like a breath on my neck. My name, slow and low, almost a growl. I didn't stop. I ran. My feet pounded on the soft earth, and my breathing was ragged and loud in my ears. The path was steep and uneven, roots and rocks making it hard to keep my footing. I tripped once, catching myself just before I fell. The voice followed me, echoing in the trees, close enough that I could swear it was just steps behind. I scrambled up a small hill and saw the main trail below me, just a few yards away. Relief flooded through me. If I could get back to the main trail, maybe I could find my way out or meet someone. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my arms swinging. When I reached the main trail, I didn't stop. I kept moving, eyes scanning the woods on both sides. The voice didn't come again. I was sure I was alone. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw my car parked where I had left it, its dark shape barely visible in the fading light. I broke into a run, and the relief was overwhelming. I reached the car, unlocked the door with trembling hands, and jumped inside. I locked the doors and sat there for a few minutes, my heart still racing. The woods were silent now. No voices, no sounds but the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to think clearly to make sense of what had happened. Had I really heard my name being called? Or was it just my mind playing tricks after a long day of hiking alone? I checked my phone for signal and called a friend. I told them I was on my way home and would meet up soon. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I started the engine and drove off, not looking back. Later, I thought about what had happened. I realized that it wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something much simpler. Someone had been out there, calling me, maybe lost or trying to scare me. But I never saw anyone. I never heard footsteps except my own. And whatever it was, it stayed hidden in the shadows. I learned to trust my instincts that day. When something feels wrong, even if you can't see it, you have to listen. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what's in front of you, but what you can't see just beyond the edge of the light. The first signs were subtle. I was sitting on a log near the fire, my hands warming up after a long hike through the woods. The sky was still light, the sun dipping low but not quite gone. The air had that heavy feeling like it was holding its breath before something happened. I didn't say anything to the others. They were busy setting up tents or talking quietly. I just felt it deep in my bones. It started with a soft wind, barely there at first, brushing against the trees. The leaves rustled in a way that didn't sound natural, like they were whispering. The birds that had been chirping suddenly stopped. Even the squirrels, usually noisy as they scrambled around, were silent. It was as if the entire forest had paused, waiting. I glanced up at the clouds. They were gathering fast, thick and dark, rolling over the hills like an angry wave. The colors changed from pale blue to a dull gray, and then to almost black. The air got colder, sharp like a knife. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and looked back toward the camp. Everyone else seemed calm, laughing around the fire, sharing food and stories. The group was about 10 people, all of us friends who'd planned this weekend trip for months. We'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from any roads or signs of civilization. The kind of place where cell phones didn't work, and the only light came from the campfire or the fading sunset. I felt a strange chill as I scanned the campsite. It was peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of quiet that presses in on you and makes your skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just the storm coming, nothing more. Then the wind picked up suddenly, stronger now, pushing through the trees with a wild force. It tore at the tent flaps, making them flap like angry flags. The fire sputtered and sparks flew up into the darkening sky. I stood up, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure moving slowly through the campsite, just beyond a circle of firelight. It wasn't someone I knew. It wasn't one of us. It was tall, thin, and wrapped in dark clothing that blended perfectly with the night. It didn't rush or hurry. It moved with a calm, quiet purpose, like it was watching, waiting for something. I froze. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might give me away. I wanted to shout or warn the others, but something stopped me. The figure hadn't noticed me, or maybe it did, but didn't care. It passed behind the tents, disappearing for a moment into the shadows, then reappeared near the edge of the firelight. I blinked hard and looked again. The figure was there, still moving slowly. I noticed it had no pack, no gear, no flashlight, nothing that someone camping would have. Just a figure blending into the dark like a shadow that didn't belong. The others were still laughing, sharing stories, oblivious to the presence moving so close to them. I could see their faces glowing red and orange in the firelight, smiling and relaxed. They had no idea. I swallowed hard and moved quietly, trying to get closer to the tents without being seen. My mind raced, trying to figure out who it was and what it wanted. I thought maybe it was a lost hiker or someone who had wandered off the trail. But why would they sneak around like that? Why not come forward and talk? The wind blew harder now, whipping leaves and branches around. The first heavy drops of rain fell, cold and sharp against my skin. The storm was coming fast, and I knew we had only minutes before it would be chaos. I kept watching the figure, trying to memorize every detail. It stopped near one of the tents, bending down as if to check something. I couldn't see what. The wind howled, drowning out any sound, but I caught a faint rustling noise like fabric being pulled or moved. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air. A branch broke off a tree nearby, smashing onto the ground. The fire flickered wildly, threatening to go out. The campers finally noticed the storm and scrambled to secure their tents and gear. Shouts and hurried footsteps filled the air. The figure melted back into the shadows, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. I wanted to call out, to follow, but the storm hit in full force. Rain pounded down like bullets, thunder rolled overhead, and lightning lit the sky in harsh white flashes. Everyone was rushing now, trying to pack gear, tie down tents, and find shelter. The wind whipped the rain sideways, making it impossible to see or hear anything clearly. I ran toward my own tent, heart racing. As I reached it, I glanced back toward where I'd seen the figure last. The trees swayed violently, and the ground was slick with mud. There was no sign of anyone, only the storm's fury. The night stretched on, wild and unforgiving. The rain didn't stop. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at the tents and shaking the trees. We huddled inside, soaked and cold, listening to the storm rage outside. In the morning, the forest was quiet again, almost peaceful. The storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches and puddles of water. We checked on each other, counting heads, making sure no one was hurt. But when we looked around the campsite, some things didn't add up. One tent had its zipper pulled down slightly, like someone had opened it quietly and then left. A pack was missing from near the fire, not forgotten but gone. And in the soft mud near the tree line, there were footprints. Not the boots of any of our group, but larger, deeper prints. They led away from the camp into the thick woods, disappearing where the trees grew too close together. No one spoke about the figure. It was as if we all felt it, but didn't want to admit it. The story hung in the air, heavy and silent. Weeks later, I still think about that night. The storm was real, terrifying on its own. But the thing that scared me most wasn't the thunder or the rain. It was that shadowy figure, moving through our camp like a ghost without magic. Just a person hiding in the dark, watching us. Who it was or what it wanted, I don't know. But I'll never forget the way it moved, the way the forest fell silent when it came close. And I'll never forget how small and alone I felt, caught between the storm and something I couldn't see clearly, but knew was real. That night started like any other solo hike I'd done before, but it quickly turned into something I couldn't shake from my mind for days afterward. I was hiking down a remote mountain trail as darkness settled. The sun had just disappeared behind the ridges hours ago, and the forest was quiet except for the faint sounds of my footsteps on the dry dirt path and the occasional rustle of dry leaves underfoot. My headlamp was the only source of light, cutting a narrow cone ahead of me as I moved slowly but steadily, eager to make it back to my car before night deepened too much. The trail was steep in parts, lined with thick pine and fir trees that blocked out most of the fading twilight. There was a sharp drop to my right for a few miles, a slope that looked treacherous even in daylight. I was aware of that and kept to the left side of the path, near the rocky embankment. My breath came out in short clouds in the cold mountain air. The forest smelled like wet pine needles and cold earth. I hadn't seen a single other person all day, which wasn't unusual for this section of the trail. It was a place few dare to hike alone after dark, and I'd made sure to bring plenty of supplies and a good flashlight just in case. At some point, I became aware of something odd. When I stopped to catch my breath, I caught a faint glimmer in the distance, two glowing greenish-yellow dots reflecting in the beam of my headlamp. I froze immediately. The eyes were about 50 yards off the trail, just inside the shadow trees on the slope. They didn't blink or move, just stared fixedly in my direction. I held my breath and scanned slowly with the light, but nothing else moved. I'd heard stories about mountain lions in this area, and those eyes had to be theirs. No other animal's eyes reflect that way, and that color is typical of a big cat. I didn't want to panic, but there was a cold knot in my stomach. I resumed walking, making sure to keep my flashlight beam moving constantly to keep the area lit. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, and every time, the green eyes were still there. They moved, keeping pace with me, but without making a sound. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe something else was catching the light, or that the angle made it look like the eyes were following me. But deep down I knew. I didn't make any sudden movements or noises, didn't try to run. I knew from reading about mountain lions that sudden movements might trigger a chase. Instead, I kept walking steadily, keeping my eyes locked on the faint glow ahead. The eyes stayed at about the same distance, never getting closer, never disappearing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The trail twisted and dropped, moving through thick brush and rocky sections. I was soaked in sweat, but I couldn't stop to rest. My heart pounded, but I tried to keep my breathing even. The mountain lion's eyes were there the whole time, not once breaking contact. It was patient and silent, stalking without a sound. At one point, the trail opened onto a ridge. The moon was just rising and gave a faint glow, enough to see the outline of the mountains and trees. I paused briefly to drink water and try to gather my thoughts. The eyes were still there, barely visible now in the shadows under a tree line about 40 yards behind me. I wondered if the lion was waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought about the best way to handle the situation. I'd heard that making yourself look big and loud might scare off a mountain lion. So I raised my arms, yelled at the top of my lungs, and banged my trekking poles on a nearby rock. The eyes didn't move. They didn't flinch. I repeated the noise a few times, but the green glow stayed put, watching me like a silent predator. It was unnerving beyond words. I didn't want to turn my back or run, so I kept walking, making sure my flashlight never wavered. My legs were tired, but I forced them to move. The mountain lion followed, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see its body, only those glowing eyes. Eventually, I reached a narrow creek crossing. The water was cold and shallow, trickling over rocks with a faint splash. I crossed carefully, knowing that animals often use water sources to move around. For a moment, the eyes vanished. There was a pause in the stalking. I dared to hope the lion had given up, but then I heard the quietest movement in the brush behind me. A soft snap of a twig, barely louder than the creek's flow. My heart jumped. I turned quickly, flashlight scanning the area. The eyes were back, closer this time, about 20 yards off the trail in the dark. I could almost make out the shape of the mountain lion's sleek body crouching low in the underbrush. Its tail flicked slowly. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe too loud. I knew running could trigger an attack, but I also knew that standing still in front of a predator was just as dangerous. I remembered that shining bright light directly into a mountain lion's eyes might confuse it. I focused my flashlight beam on the eyes and kept it steady. The eyes blinked briefly, then the mountain lion slowly backed away, disappearing behind a thick stand of bushes. I didn't wait. I kept moving fast, but carefully, following the trail back to the car. The eyes didn't reappear. When I finally saw the taillights of my car parked at the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure if the mountain lion had given up or if it had simply decided I wasn't worth the effort. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. Once inside the car, I locked the doors, took a deep breath, and sat in silence for a few minutes before starting the engine. The cold sweat on my skin was a reminder of how close I come to danger. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting those glowing eyes to reappear in the trees behind me. But they never did. That night stayed with me, not just because of the fear, but because it was a raw, real encounter with a wild animal that could have ended badly. No fancy stories, no ghosts, just a mountain lion following me silently through the night, watching and waiting. It taught me a lot about respect for the wilderness and the creatures that live there. I'll never forget those green eyes in the dark or the way it moved. Patient, quiet, and deadly. And I know now that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what makes noise or attacks, but what watches you in silence, just waiting for the right moment. The night had settled in deep, heavier than any night I'd experienced in a long time. The woods around our campsite were dark and silent, except for the soft crackle of the fire we had built earlier. Our group was made up of 5 friends, me included, and we had set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The kind of trees that block out any moonlight or distant city glow. So the night was pitch black beyond the firelight. We'd been talking and laughing earlier, passing around a bottle of water, sharing stories, just enjoying the quiet that only comes when you're away from phones and the usual noise of everyday life. The fire was dying down slowly, the logs giving off a soft, warm glow. My eyelids were starting to feel heavy, and I was glad when a few of the others decided to turn in early. We all had our sleeping bags stretched out around the fire pit, close enough to keep the fire going for a while, but spread out just enough for some personal space. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze. The sound was faint, but it was definitely there. Footsteps on dry leaves and twigs, slow and deliberate. not the usual rustling of small animals or the wind moving through the branches. I nudged one of my friends who was lying near me. His eyes flicked open and we both sat up listening. The footsteps stopped, and a few seconds later, we saw it. Two beams of light, flashlights, moving slowly and carefully between the trees on the far side of the clearing. We all sat up fully now, alert. The others had woken up too, rubbing their eyes and trying to make sense of the moving lights. Nobody said a word. The footsteps started again, and the flashlights moved closer to the edge of our camp, just beyond where the firelight reached. At first, I thought it was one of our friends going for a late-night bathroom break or checking something outside the tents, but then I remembered. Everyone had said they were staying put, too tired to move. We all agreed earlier we'd stick together. Something about the way the lights moved felt wrong, like whoever was out there wasn't just wandering, but searching for something. Or maybe someone. I quietly grabbed my own flashlight from the ground and motioned for the others to follow. We slipped out of our sleeping bags and moved toward the trees, careful not to make noise. The fire flickered behind us, a small bright circle in the dark, and the cold night air bit at my skin. The forest smelled like wet leaves and pine needles. The flashlights moved again, this time circling the edge of our camp, swinging slowly between the trees. It was like whoever was carrying them was trying to stay just out of sight, but close enough to see what was inside the clearing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, a tight knot in my stomach. My mind raced. Was this someone from outside the group? A hiker? A hunter? Someone with bad intentions? We stayed low, moving quietly through the underbrush, trying to keep the flashlights in sight without being seen. As we got closer, I caught a glimpse of the person carrying the light. They were wearing dark clothes, the kind that would blend in well with the night. Their face was hidden by a hood or a hat, so I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. The group whispered among themselves, questions hanging in the air, but no answers. We decided to move closer to try to get a better look, but as we advanced, the flashlights suddenly stopped. The footsteps ceased again. It was completely silent. We held our breath. The forest seemed to hold its own breath with us, waiting. Then, without warning, the flashlights swung sharply back into the woods and disappeared. The footsteps, too, moved off quickly, crunching through leaves and twigs, heading away from the camp. We followed the sounds as quietly as we could, weaving through trees and dodging branches. The footprints they left in the dirt were fresh, too deep to be an animal. After a few minutes, the sounds and lights faded into the distance. The forest swallowed them whole, and all that was left was the quiet hum of night insects and the distant call of an owl. We stood there for a long moment, looking at each other in the dark, trying to figure out what just happened. Everyone was shaken, but nobody wanted to speak first. Then I realized something. When we had first seen the flashlights, none of us had checked if anyone was missing from camp. So we turned back, walking fast, anxious to get back to our tents and make sure everyone was okay. As we stepped into the clearing, our flashlights bounced off the tents, the sleeping bags, the backpacks, all still there. Inside the tents, faint shadows moved as people stirred awake. We called out quietly, and each friend answered back, sleepy and confused. No one had left camp. No one had moved or walked outside in the night. We gathered in the fire pit's circle again, voices hushed but tense. No one had gone out. The only people around were us and whoever had been walking outside in the woods, shining flashlights near our camp. It didn't make sense. If none of us had left, who had been there? We checked the perimeter again, flashlight beams scanning the edges of the clearing, but we found nothing. No footprints going away, no signs that anyone had been there besides us. The dirt around the camp was undisturbed except for our own tracks. A cold feeling crept over me. Not from the night air, but from the thought of someone so close, so near to us, but completely unseen. The idea that someone had been circling us quietly, watching us, made my skin crawl. We sat back down by the fire, still alert. We decided to keep the fire burning bright the rest of the night and to stay awake in shifts, each watching the edge of the forest. No one wanted to say it, but the possibility of someone with bad intentions had crept into our minds and refused to leave. The rest of the night passed slowly, with every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting us on edge. The stars wheeled above us in a clear sky. The forest silent except for our nervous whispers and the crackling fire. When dawn finally came, pale and cool, we packed up fast and left that clearing without looking back. The sun brought warmth and safety that night had stolen away. We never found out who had been there, circling our camp, shining those flashlights in the dark. But the memory of that night, the feeling of being watched and surrounded by something unseen but very real, stayed with me long after we returned to the safety of our homes. The woods can hold secrets, not all explained, but some are just too close for comfort. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster. It's knowing that someone was out there, near you, when you thought you were alone. The night had settled deep into the woods, folding everything into shadows and silence. My friend and I had spent the day hiking to a remote camping spot we'd found a few years back but hadn't visited since. The place was tucked away near a thick stand of fir trees and overlooked a small, quiet clearing. It was perfect for escaping the noise of the world and sleeping under the stars. We arrived late in the afternoon and spent a couple of hours setting up our tents and gathering firewood. The sun was already low when we built a small campfire near our tents, its flickering light pushing back the darkness just enough. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds had stopped singing long ago, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl or the crackle of twigs as small animals moved through the brush. We sat quietly by the fire, eating some trail mix and sipping water from our bottles. Neither of us said much. The kind of quiet that settles between friends when you're just soaking in the calm of nature. Our tents were pitched just a few feet from the fire, and everything felt peaceful until it wasn't. As the fire burned lower, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At first, it was just a faint movement near the edge of the clearing where the trees were thickest. I turned my head slowly to look, trying not to startle whatever it was. That's when I saw the eyes, two small, glowing, unblinking eyes reflecting the last bits of the firelight. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or some other harmless animal, but the shape was different, larger, sleeker. Then I saw the head, the shape of it unmistakable in the faint light. It was a cougar, just sitting there, maybe 20 feet beyond our tent, barely moving, watching us silently. My heart froze. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing, but the cougar didn't move. It was like it was studying us or maybe deciding what to do next. The silence was suddenly overwhelming, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I could barely breathe. My friend noticed it too and stopped moving. We both froze, eyes locked on that silent shape just beyond the tent. The cougar's muscles twitched occasionally, but it didn't get up or make a sound. The night was so still that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. We didn't want to make any sudden moves. I thought about the stories I'd heard, the warnings about what to do if you encounter a cougar. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Make noise. But none of that seemed right in the moment. The cougar wasn't aggressive yet, just watching, waiting. Maybe it was as scared of us as we were of it. Minutes passed like hours. The fire had almost burned down to glowing embers, casting a weak, orange light. The cougar's eyes never left us. I noticed its powerful legs folded beneath it, its tail twitching softly on the ground. The night air was cold, and the faint scent of smoke mingled with the sharp, wild smell of the animal. I dared to shift slightly, just enough to reach for my flashlight without looking away. I clicked it on and pointed it in the cougar's direction, the beam cutting through the dark. The animal didn't flinch, but blinked once, slowly, then rose to its feet. It stood up quietly, every muscle tense but controlled, like a shadow stretched tall in the light. The muscles in its shoulders and back rippled as it moved with silent grace. The cougar's ears twitched, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves. It took a few steps closer, its paws barely making a sound on the dirt. My mind was racing, but my body was still. I didn't want to provoke it. I stayed as calm as I could, trying not to breathe too loudly. My friend was just as quiet, the two of us locked in a moment of pure tension, caught between fear and awe. The cougar stopped just at the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from our tent. It turned its head slightly, sniffing the air. Then, slowly, it sat back down as if it had made its decision. It wasn't going to attack, at least not yet. We waited, watching the animal carefully. It stayed there, motionless, eyes glinting in the flashlight beam, until the fire finally burned out and the forest grew darker than before. The only light was from our weak flashlights and the stars above, hidden behind the thick tree canopy. After what felt like forever, the cougar finally stood up again. This time, it didn't move toward us. Instead, it turned and slipped silently back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing without a sound. We waited for a long time after that, eyes scanning the dark woods around us. Neither of us wanted to move or speak. The silence was thick, but it felt safer to stay still. Finally, we crawled into our tents, zipped the door shut, and lay awake for hours, listening to every small sound in the night. The next morning, the sun crept through the trees and lit up the clearing. The forest looked peaceful again, almost like nothing had happened. We packed up quickly, still feeling the weight of the night's tension in our bodies. As we walked back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us again. But the woods were empty. We didn't say much on the way home. No need to. That silent moment with the cougar was enough. It was a reminder that even in the quietest, most beautiful places, nature is wild and powerful. And sometimes it watches you, waiting for you to prove you belong. That night stuck with me for a long time. The memory of those eyes, the stillness, the sheer presence of something so wild and so close. It made me respect the forest more and the animals that call home. It was a real encounter, raw and unforgettable, and it reminded me that out there, you're never truly alone. But sometimes it's better that way. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when we reached the clearing. We had been hiking for hours, pushing through thick forest and uneven ground, our legs tired, but our spirits still high from the quiet beauty around us. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth, but something about this clearing felt off the moment we stepped into it. It wasn't the place itself, just a small patch surrounded by tall trees, the kind of spot that usually invites a moment's rest. But there, hanging from a low branch of an old twisted tree, was something so out of place and so deeply wrong it made the hairs on my neck stand up. A coyote, skinned and strung up by its limbs like some sort of totem or warning. The fur had been stripped clean, its flesh exposed in a gruesome display. The way it hung, limbs stretched and tied tight with what looked like old rope, made it seem less like an animal and more like a message. Its eyes were missing, leaving two dark, empty holes staring into the clearing, as if the thing was still watching. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was some sick prank, maybe left by hunters or someone trying to scare off other animals or hikers. But the way the skin had been carefully removed, the precision of the cuts, and the deliberate way it was hung wasn't random. It was meant to be seen, meant to be a warning. The others were quiet, looking around nervously. None of us said anything, but I could feel the weight of their gaze as we all took in the grisly scene. The late afternoon light filtered through the branches, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground, making the whole place feel even darker than it was. We had planned to rest here, maybe set up camp nearby, but that thought vanished the moment we saw the coyote. There was no way any of us wanted to stay in a place like this. Still, we couldn't just turn around and go back the way we came. The trail was rough and night was coming fast, so we decided to keep moving, sticking close to each other as we walked through the dense woods that bordered the clearing. The silence around us grew heavy. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. My ears strained for any sound, my senses on edge. Then from somewhere deeper in the trees, a low growl echoed. It was soft at first, almost a rumble beneath the earth, but it grew louder, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. I scanned the shadows, trying to spot what could have made the sound, but there was nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes, no rustling branches. Just a deep, vibrating growl coming from all around us, but no animal in sight. The others stopped, their faces tense. We all felt it. The eyes, the invisible gaze that seemed to crawl over our skin like cold fingers. Every step forward became heavier, like we were being watched by something we couldn't see. The growls continued, sometimes from the left, sometimes the right, always near, but never visible. It was unnerving. The natural noises of the forest had vanished, replaced by this low, threatening sound that kept us on edge. I kept thinking about the skinned coyote. Whatever had done that was still out there, and it wasn't just some wild animal. There was something deliberate, something dangerous in the way the growls seemed to circle us. We tried to move quietly, but every crunch of leaves beneath our boots felt loud, announcing our presence to whatever was stalking us. My heart pounded, and my hands itched to reach for my knife. Hours felt like minutes as we pushed through the darkening woods. The growling never stopped. Sometimes it seemed to come from just beyond the trees, close enough to make me think we might be attacked at any moment. But no attack came. No flash of teeth or sudden rush. Just the feeling of being hunted, watched, and tested. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the forest began to thin. The trail opened up to a wider path, and I saw the faint glow of our campsite lights in the distance. Relief flooded me. We didn't stop until we reached the fire. We dropped our packs and sat in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. The growls were gone now, lost somewhere back in the dark woods. As I stared into the flames, I thought about what we'd seen. The skinned coyote strung up like a warning. The unseen presence watching us. The growls that came from nowhere, but everywhere at once. It wasn't just some wild animal out there. It was something else. Something human. Maybe a person or people who knew these woods better than we did, and who wanted us to know we were trespassing. That night, none of us slept well. Every rustle, every snap of twig made us jump. The forest felt alive with eyes. By morning, we packed up and left, sticking to the main trail and moving fast. We never spoke about what happened in that clearing, but the memory stayed with me long after. The image of that coyote, skinned and hung like a warning, the invisible growls in the dark, and the feeling that we'd been watched by something cold and cruel. Some places in the woods are better left alone. Some warnings are meant to be heeded. We learned that the hard way. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you and makes every small sound feel louder than it should. I had been hiking for hours, lost in my own thoughts, enjoying the way the tall trees filtered the late afternoon sunlight into soft green patterns on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mix of damp leaves, pine, and moss. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the broken branches and piles of cut wood stacked in messy heaps alongside the trail. It was clear that the forest wasn't untouched. Someone had been working here, cutting trees and clearing the brush, but still felt wild and remote. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail started to disappear, swallowed up by thick bushes and fallen branches. I decided to leave it and follow a narrow path made by animals or maybe people who didn't use the main route. The forest was quieter here, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of birds chirping or squirrels running up trees were missing, replaced by a kind of low hum from the wind passing through the branches. I didn't mind. It was peaceful, but also a little unsettling. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon something odd, a pile of branches and logs that had clearly been chopped and stacked recently. It was a slash pile, a messy heap left over from logging or clearing the forest floor. The wood was fresh and smelled strongly of sap. At the edge of the pile, something caught my eye. A small, worn shoe lay on top of the branches. It was a child's shoe, a little sneaker, faded and dirty, with one of the laces undone and trailing off the pile like it had been tossed there without care. I knelt down to look closer. The shoe was old, maybe weeks or months, but it was definitely a kid's. It was too small to be anything but a child's shoe, the kind you'd see on a 5 or 6-year-old. The sole was scuffed and the fabric was torn in a few places. The sight of it felt strange, almost out of place in such a wild, empty spot. I looked around, expecting to see a child nearby, but the forest was still and empty. Then I heard it, faint laughter. It wasn't a loud or clear sound, more like a soft, distant giggle carried on the wind. It was the kind of laughter a child might make while playing hide and seek, light and careless. I froze. The sound came again, a little louder this time, but still far off and impossible to locate. I scanned the trees and the brush, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone else. Just the quiet forest and the smell of pine. The laughter stopped. A heavy silence took its place, thicker than before. My skin prickled, and I felt a sudden chill despite the warm air. I stood up and looked back at the slash pile. The shoe still lay there, unchanged. I couldn't explain why, but my stomach twisted into a knot. The place felt wrong. I moved closer to the pile, careful not to disturb anything. I tried to think through what I was feeling. Had a child been here recently? Lost? Hurt? Did someone come after them? The thought was hard to shake. The forest was deep and isolated, and if a child had wandered here alone, it could be dangerous. The absence of any footprints or other signs was puzzling, but maybe the soft earth had covered them by now, or maybe the child had been carried away. I picked up the shoe carefully, turning it over in my hands. It was light, empty. I looked around again, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The laughter hadn't come back. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I decided to keep moving, wanting to get out of the thick trees and back to the trail I'd lost earlier. But as I turned, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A small figure, maybe a child, darted between the trees at the edge of my vision. I spun around fast, but there was nothing there. Just the dense brush and shadows. My heart pounded. I told myself it was just a deer or some small animal, nothing more. But something about the way the figure had moved, too quick, too purposeful, didn't feel right. I stepped forward cautiously, following where I thought the figure had disappeared. The forest got darker as the sun sank lower. Shadows stretched long and thick, twisting between trunks. The silence returned, broken only by the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and twigs. The air felt heavy, almost humid, and I could smell something else now. Something faint and sharp, like burnt wood mixed with something sour. I came to a small clearing, a patch of soft moss surrounded by thick trees. The slash piles were more frequent here, like someone had cleared this spot carefully. At the edge of the clearing, I saw a faint trail of tiny footprints leading away into the trees. They were small, like a child's, but the dirt was soft and easily disturbed. The prints were fresh, no older than a day. I followed them, stepping carefully over roots and low branches. The footprints led deeper into the woods, winding between thick trunks and bushes until they stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep drop. A narrow ravine cut through the forest, its walls covered in moss and ferns. The bottom was hidden by shadows, and I could hear the faint sound of water, a small stream or creek running far below. I looked down the ravine. It was deep and dangerous. If a child had fallen here, it would be bad. I called out softly, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice and the distant rustle of leaves. A cold feeling settled in my chest. I scanned the edges of the ravine, hoping to see something, a toy, a piece of clothing, anything. But there was nothing. The footprints stopped too suddenly, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest was growing dark fast. I knew I needed to get back to the main trail before night fell completely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. As I turned to leave, the faint laughter came again, softer this time, almost a whisper. It seemed to come from all directions, circling me. I stopped and listened, heart racing. The laughter faded slowly, replaced by the deep, steady sound of the creek and the rustling leaves. I kept walking, my steps quicker now, pushing through the bushes toward the trail I had left hours ago. The forest closed in around me, the dark thickening with every step. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the trail, the last light of day was gone. The path was easier to follow now under the weak beam of my flashlight. I walked steadily, the strange feeling easing as the sounds of the forest returned. Birds calling in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig from a small animal. Later, at home, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The child's shoe, the laughter, the footprints that vanished by the ravine. It was a puzzle I couldn't solve. There were no reports of missing children in the area, and the forest was rarely visited this late in the year. I wondered if the shoe had been there for months, left behind by some kid who had wandered close to the logging area. Maybe the laughter was an echo, a trick of the wind, or the way the forest carries sound. But something about the whole thing stayed with me. The way the laughter seemed so real, but no child ever appeared. The way the footprints led to nowhere. The cold feeling in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't leave. In the end, I realized the forest was just a place where strange things could happen. And sometimes people leave behind pieces of their story without ever finishing it. That shoe was a sign, maybe a warning, that even in the quietest places, life goes on in ways we don't always understand. I never found out what really happened, but I know one thing for sure. Some mysteries don't need ghosts or fairy tales to be scary. They're scary just because they're real, and because sometimes the forest keeps its secrets well hidden. Late at night, the campground was alive with sounds, the crackling of campfires, quiet laughter, the low hum of people settling in for sleep. It was the kind of place that felt safe, like the world had shrunk down to just this one small clearing surrounded by trees. Families, friends, and strangers had come together for a weekend away from the city, all sharing the same peaceful spot tucked away deep in the woods. I was lying in my tent, half awake, half asleep, when I first heard it, a girl's desperate cries for help. At first, I thought it was part of someone's late-night joke, maybe a prank or a kid messing around, trying to scare people. The voice was raw, scared, and it echoed through the trees like it was coming from all around the campground. It wasn't far, but it wasn't close either, like someone was lost somewhere nearby, stuck out in the dark woods beyond the campsites. The way she screamed, it was clear she was terrified. It wasn't a call for fun. It was real. People started waking up, stepping out of their tents, looking around confused and worried. Some grabbed flashlights and lanterns, others their phones, trying to get a signal or call for help. The whole campground stirred from its usual quiet night. The crying continued, sometimes louder, sometimes fading away, but always desperate. It sent a chill down my spine. You never expect something like that in a place like this. A group of campers decided to search for her. They moved together, talking quietly as they stepped off the trails into the woods, following the sound. The woods were thick, the trees close together, and the ground uneven with roots and fallen leaves. It was hard to walk quietly, and the darkness made it feel like the trees were closing in. Every now and then, the cries would come again, sharp and clear. The group moved cautiously, calling out, trying to make sure they didn't miss her. Minutes passed, then longer. The cries led deeper into the forest, farther than most of us thought anyone would wander by accident. The campers pushed forward, their lights cutting through the blackness, their voices low and steady. Eventually, they found her, a young girl, no older than 10 or 12, standing in a small clearing. She looked lost, shaking, eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything, just stared ahead as if she was frozen in place. The campers quickly gathered around her, wrapping her in a blanket someone had brought. They asked her questions, but she didn't answer. She just kept looking around, like she was expecting something to come out of the trees at any moment. Slowly, they led her back toward the campground. The group now doubled in size, with more people joining to help. Everyone felt a mix of relief and unease. The girl was safe, but why was she out there alone? Who was she? When they reached the crowd, someone tried to find her parents, but no one came forward. No one claimed her. Campers looked at each other, confused and worried. A search started for anyone missing, but no one reported a lost child. It was strange. The girl had wandered into the campground, crying for help, but no one had seen her before. She wasn't part of any group. No one at the nearby campsites recognized her or said they had seen her around all day. The park rangers were called, and they began asking questions, taking notes. They carefully searched the nearby woods again, checking the trails and paths to see where she could have come from. The girl stayed quiet the whole time, sitting close to one of the rangers, her hands clasped tight, her eyes still scanning the woods. She seemed scared to go anywhere or speak. No phone calls came in about a missing child matching her description. No one reported anyone walking alone in the woods. As the night deepened, the mood around the campground changed. What started as a fun weekend trip now felt tense and uneasy. Parents gathered their children closer, and strangers who had been friendly before suddenly watched each other more carefully. The feeling of safety, that simple comfort of being away from the city, was gone. The woods no longer felt like a place of adventure, but a place full of unknown dangers. By morning, the girl was taken to a nearby ranger station. The police arrived and began a more thorough investigation. They tried to figure out who she was and how she got there. The girl still wouldn't talk much, only nodding or shaking her head when asked simple questions. It was clear something terrible had happened to her, but what exactly, no one knew. Days passed. The girl was put in protective care. The campground slowly returned to normal, but the story lingered. People talked in low voices about the night when the girl's cries shattered the quiet. Some wondered if she had run away from home. Others thought maybe she had been lost or hurt by someone in the woods. But no one knew for sure. The most frightening part wasn't the woods or the dark. It was that the girl had been out there alone, lost and afraid, while the rest of the campground had no idea. The whole experience left a mark on everyone. It reminded us how fragile our sense of safety is, even in a crowded place full of people. How someone could be right under our noses, screaming for help, and we don't really know who they are. It made me look at the woods differently, the quiet trails and the shadows between trees. The night the girl cried out was a night none of us will forget. And in the end, the only clear thing was that she had never been with any of us. Not really. She had been alone, lost in the dark, desperate for help, and somehow, by chance or fate, someone heard her and found her just in time. That's what saved her. No magic, no ghosts, just the sharp edge of fear, the cold night, and the chance that someone was listening. We had been driving for hours. The winding dirt road stretched out ahead of us, flanked by thick pine trees, so tall they blocked out most of the fading sunlight. My wife, 2 kids, and I were heading deeper into the forest, away from the noise and stress of city life. The plan was simple: set up camp in a remote spot, spend a few nights disconnected from everything, and just breathe. I'd grown up camping, so I was confident about picking a good place. The spot we found was exactly what I wanted: flat ground, a little clearing surrounded by dense trees, near a small creek that babbled quietly just a short walk away. Perfect. After unloading the gear from the back of our SUV, we worked together setting up the tent. It was a big family tent with mesh windows on all sides for ventilation. The kids helped me hammer the stakes while my wife unpacked the cooler and arranged the food on a folding table. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, mixed with the faint scent of campfire smoke from a distant group, maybe a mile or 2 away. Night fell fast in the forest, earlier than we expected. Once the tent was up, I built a small fire pit from some stones and gathered firewood nearby. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees and on the faces of my family as we ate hot dogs and roasted marshmallows. The kids were full of energy, running around the clearing, chasing each other and laughing under the dim glow of the fire. The stars were sharp above, the Milky Way stretching like a silver ribbon across the sky. After dinner, we cleaned up, making sure to store all food tightly sealed inside the car to avoid attracting animals. I double-checked that everything was secure, and we climbed into the tent to get ready for bed. The kids fell asleep quickly, tired from the day's hike and excitement. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the night sounds, the rush of the creek nearby, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of wind through the pine needles. My wife was already asleep next to me. The tent mesh let in the cool night air, crisp and fresh, a little chill that made me pull the blanket up a bit higher. At first, everything was peaceful. Then I noticed it, eyes. Two bright, glowing points just outside the mesh window, maybe 3 feet away. The color was strange, a sort of yellow-green glow that didn't look like any reflection I'd seen before. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The eyes were steady, unblinking. I swallowed hard, trying to remind myself that I wasn't alone. My family was right here, safe. The eyes didn't blink or move. They just stared, glowing in the dark. I strained to make out the shape behind the eyes, but the mesh window and the darkness made it difficult. It was large, standing still just outside the edge of the firelight that had long since died down. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The kids were still asleep, breathing evenly, unaware of what was outside. The creature's eyes held me in place, cold and silent. Then, slowly, the eyes retreated. The glow faded as the figure slipped back into the woods, swallowed by the shadows. It moved without a sound. No branches snapped, no leaves rustled loudly. Just a smooth, quiet disappearance. I didn't speak, didn't move until I was sure it was gone. I lay back, my heart racing, but relief started to seep in. Whatever it was, it hadn't come closer. It hadn't tried to enter the tent. The next morning, I stepped outside carefully. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, the creek sparkling in the sun, birds singing from the branches. But the ground near the tent had fresh tracks, large paw prints, deeper and bigger than any dog or coyote I knew. I studied the prints closely. They were from something heavy, maybe a bear or a large wildcat. But bears usually make noise, grunt, or snort. This thing had been silent, almost too quiet to be natural. Despite the fear from the night, I made sure the kids stayed close while I explored the area. I checked our food storage and tightened everything up. We kept the fire pit burning well that day. The crackling flames a small comfort against the unknown. Over the next 2 days, we stayed alert. We heard noises around the camp, footsteps crunching on pine needles, occasional low growls far off in the woods, but nothing came close again. The forest felt alive with eyes watching from the shadows, but never as close as that first night. On our last night, I stayed awake longer, sitting just outside the tent with a flashlight and the fire still burning. I scanned the tree line carefully. The night was cold but clear, the stars bright above. Nothing came. When morning finally arrived, I felt a mix of relief and respect. We packed up quietly, not daring to leave anything behind. The kids were tired but safe, unaware of the danger that had crept so close to our little campsite. Driving away, I glanced back once at the tall pines disappearing behind us. The forest had kept its secrets, and we had lived through them. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just the wild. And the wild had reminded us who was really in charge. The sun was already dipping behind the ridges when we finally decided to stop for the night. The Appalachian Trail stretched out behind us in thick shadows, and the last bit of light made the leaves glow gold and red. The air was cool, but not cold, just the kind of evening that makes you want to sit down and rest for a while. We'd been hiking all day, a good 6 hours, maybe more, and every one of us was tired and eager for some kind of break. We found a small clearing off the main path where a fire ring was already built. It looked like a perfect spot to camp. There was some dry wood stacked neatly nearby, and the ground was mostly flat, covered with soft pine needles. We knew it had to be a place someone else had used before, but that wasn't unusual on the trail. We all moved quickly, setting down our packs and starting to gather more wood for a fire. That's when we noticed the boots. They were sitting right beside the fire ring, worn and dirty, like someone had kicked them off and just left them there. Brown leather, scuffed up and cracked from what looked like a long hike, with thick mud caked on the soles. They weren't new boots by any means. I could tell just by looking at them that they'd been through a lot. But the weird part was that no one was around them. No sleeping bag, no pack, no sign of a person anywhere near the camp. Just the boots, sitting there as if whoever owned them had vanished. I told the others, and we all stopped what we were doing to look closer. It didn't seem right. On the trail, people don't just leave their boots behind, especially if they're halfway through a hike. Someone had to be close by. I scanned the edge of the clearing, moving my flashlight beam into the shadows beyond the trees. Nothing. No movement. No signs of a person or a campsite nearby. We called out quietly, just to be sure. No answer. We felt uneasy, but decided not to ignore it. We set up camp a little farther from the fire ring with the boots. I made sure my backpack was packed with everything I needed within reach: water, knife, flashlight, and checked that my phone had enough battery, even though we had no signal here. The others did the same, and we sat in a loose circle around a small fire we built, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. As night fell, the forest grew quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves from a breeze or small animal. The sky was clear and stars started to shine overhead, but the shadows around us felt heavy. I kept glancing toward the boots, half expecting someone to appear, but no one did. Hours passed, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I pulled my jacket tighter and leaned forward, staring into the flames when I thought I saw a shape move in the trees across the clearing. I froze, eyes wide, and nudged the person beside me. She looked, but there was nothing there. Just a trick of the light, maybe. Still, none of us could shake the feeling we were being watched. We decided to take turns keeping watch overnight. I volunteered for the first shift because I wanted to see if anything would happen. The fire was low but still burning, and the rest of the group huddled in their sleeping bags, whispering softly among themselves. I sat on a log, eyes peeled on the tree lean beyond the clearing. The forest was dense and dark, but my flashlight cut through the blackness in a narrow cone of light. Then I saw it again, a shadow. It was tall and thin, standing perfectly still just beyond the ring of trees, maybe 100 yards away. I didn't move or breathe too loudly. The figure didn't step forward or move sideways. Just watching. I blinked, trying to make out details, but it was too dark. Just a shadow, no face, no clothes visible, nothing but a dark outline against the moonlit trunks. I whispered to the group and pointed toward the figure, but before anyone could get a better look, it vanished like it melted into the night. The silence returned. We all knew it wasn't someone just passing by. No one moves like that in the woods, standing so still and watching. It wasn't deer or bear either. Animals don't stay in one spot staring at people. The next morning, we packed up quickly, trying not to look back at the boots or the clearing. We kept moving, hiking faster than usual. The woods around us seemed alive in a different way. Every snap of a twig, every bird call felt sharper, closer. As we walked, I kept thinking about those boots. Who had owned them? Why were they left behind? And most of all, why had that figure watched us through the night? We didn't talk much about it while hiking, but the tension was there. We all felt it. We came across a ranger station later in the day, and I told the ranger about what we'd found. He nodded slowly, telling me this part of the trail wasn't heavily trafficked, but hikers did sometimes report seeing people who seemed out of place. Sometimes folks who were desperate or in trouble, or worse, people trying to stay hidden. He warned us to be careful and said to always stick to the main trail, especially at night. That was the moment it clicked for me. The boots probably belonged to someone who was still close by, maybe hiding or watching for us. Someone who didn't want to be found. We had been lucky to stumble upon their camp first, and even luckier that nothing happened while we stayed there. The figure we saw wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was real. A person lurking just out of sight, using the dark and the woods to stay hidden. They'd been watching us all along, probably deciding whether we were a threat or prey. We never saw the boots or that clearing again, and after that night, I always stayed alert on the trail. The woods are beautiful, but they hide a lot more than just trees and animals. Some people are better left unseen, and some dangers don't need to chase you down to be deadly. Just watching you quietly is enough. I was driving alone on a mountain road late at night. The kind of road where there are no streetlights, no houses, and barely any other cars. Just sharp turns, tall pine trees pressing in on both sides, and the distant sound of wind through the branches. I'd been on this route a few times before, but never this late and never alone. The night was quiet except for the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional crackle of the radio, which I kept low to avoid feeling too alone. The road was narrow and winding, climbing higher as it twisted through the mountain. I had my headlights on, cutting bright white beams through the dark. The beam bounced off the yellow lines, the trees, the guardrails that showed me the edge of the road. I knew the bends well, so I kept my speed steady, slow enough to handle the sharp turns, but fast enough to keep moving without too much tension building inside me. About 20 minutes in, as I was coming around a long right bend, I caught the flicker of another vehicle's taillights in my rearview mirror. It was far behind, maybe a quarter of a mile back. I barely noticed it at first, thinking it was just someone else driving the same road. But as the minutes passed, the red glow didn't get smaller. It stayed the same size, like that vehicle was keeping pace with me no matter what I did. I glanced over my shoulder several times. The car behind me didn't have its headlights on. There were no bright beams shining through the mirror, no flashing lights or anything. Just two dim red dots glowing steadily in the dark. It was so close I could almost read the license plate if my headlights hit it, but they didn't because they were off. No headlights, just the red tail lights, glowing faintly through the night. The road narrowed even more as I climbed, and the trees grew thicker. The moon was low and hidden behind clouds, so the only light came from my car's headlights and those red dots behind me. My stomach tightened. Something about that car felt wrong. It was illegal to drive without headlights on a road like this, especially at night. And it was keeping pace behind me like it was following. I slowed down slightly to see if it would pass me. Usually, if someone is behind you for a while, they'll want to go faster or take the lead. But this car stayed right behind, matching my speed perfectly. Every time I accelerated around a corner or down a straight stretch, those tail lights stayed steady behind me, like they were watching. I didn't dare look away for long. The highway curves were getting sharper now, and the trees were so close I could see branches scraping against the side of my car as I turned. The sound of the tires gripping the pavement filled the silence. I wanted to believe that the car behind was just another driver like me, maybe lost or tired, but my gut told me otherwise. I remember the stories people told about that stretch of road, drivers getting followed or worse, but I pushed those thoughts away. The rational part of me said maybe the driver behind me had a broken headlight, or maybe it was an emergency vehicle of some kind. But no sirens, no flashing lights, no other signs. I tried to stay calm. I kept my eyes forward, checking the mirrors often. The car stayed exactly the same distance behind me, close enough to see the glow of the red lights, but never passing, never leaving. It was like it was stuck on my tail. Then I came to a sharp left bend, the kind that cuts through a cliff edge with a steep drop on one side. My car's headlights caught the guardrail and the jagged rocks far below. I slowed even more, taking the turn carefully, hugging the inside lane. As I rounded the bend, the red lights behind me suddenly vanished. One moment they were there, just a little way back, and the next moment they were gone. No flash of passing, no quick disappearance. Just nothing. My heart jumped. I stopped the car at the edge of the turn and looked back over my shoulder and down the road. The headlights still cut bright slices through the dark in front, but behind me, only blackness. No other cars, no tail lights. I waited a minute. The row behind me was empty. I started to wonder if I had imagined it, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me. It had been too real. Then, as I sat there, I noticed something on the ground near the guardrail where I had stopped. There was a long, deep scrape in the asphalt, like a car had braked hard or slid on the road. The marks curved sharply, following the bend exactly where the car behind me must have been. I got out of my car and walked closer. The night air was cold and smelled like pine and wet earth. The scrape was fresh, the black tar torn up and rough. And next to the scrape, a faint patch of oil stained the pavement. It looked like something had been leaking. I crouched down to get a better look. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The scrape was too perfect, too deliberate. It looked like someone had lost control, or maybe someone had purposely swerved to disappear around that bend. I thought about what might have happened to the driver behind me. Did they hit the guardrail? Did their car spin out? Or did they stop somewhere hidden, waiting to come back? I looked up and down the road. The trees were thick and the steep drop was on one side, meaning there was no shoulder or place to pull off easily. If a car had crashed there, I probably wouldn't see it right away, especially at night. I sat back in my car, my hands shaking a little. I wasn't sure what was more unsettling, that the car had followed me with no lights or that it had vanished without a trace. I thought about calling the police or reporting it, but cell service was spotty at best on this road. I was miles from the nearest town, and I wasn't even sure if I had the strength to keep driving. Still, I knew I had to get off that mountain road. I turned the key, started the engine, and began to drive again. This time, I kept my eyes glued to the road and the mirrors, watching for any sign of that car coming back. For the next 10 miles, nothing followed me. No red lights, no shadow behind me, just the steady hum of my tires and the wind through the trees. When I finally reached the highway that led to the town, my phone signal returned. I called the local sheriff's office and told them what I'd seen. They asked for details about the scrape and the oil and promised to check the area. The next day, I drove back with a friend who was more familiar with the area. We stopped at the bend. Sure enough, the scrape was still there, and the oil stain had darkened, fresh and unmistakable. They said cars had crashed there before, often because of the tight turn and narrow road. It was a spot where it was easy to lose control, especially at night. I learned later that the vehicle with no headlights probably had a mechanical failure, and maybe the driver was trying to keep up behind me, hoping for help. Or maybe they lost control and crashed just out of sight. It was terrifying to think about being followed like that. But what scared me most was knowing how easy it was for something bad to happen on that road in the dark, and how close I'd been to a real accident without even realizing it. That night stayed with me, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of the raw, real danger that lurks on quiet mountain roads when the world is silent and you're alone. The night had fallen deep and thick, settling over the forest like a heavy blanket. I was alone in my campsite, tucked away in a remote part of the woods I'd found after a long hike that day. The small fire I'd built was nearly dead, just a few glowing embers struggling against the cold, dark air. I'd already eaten my dinner, dried out my wet socks by the flames, and settled into my sleeping bag inside my tent. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on you until even the smallest sound feels loud. I lay there listening, my mind starting to wander, when I heard it, soft whispers, so faint I thought I was imagining them. At first, it was just a vague murmur, like the wind brushing through the leaves. But then I heard it clearly. Someone was calling my name. Not shouting or urgent, just a low, breathy whisper that seemed to drift from somewhere deep in the trees around me. The voice wasn't loud or sharp. It was smooth, almost gentle, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, staring out through the mesh of my tent, my heart beating fast. The voice called again softly, "Chris," it was my name, unmistakably. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat on my back, and for a moment I wanted to just stay silent and wait for whatever it was to pass. But then my curiosity got the better of me. I leaned out of the tent, peering into the darkness beyond the small circle of light from my dying fire. The woods stretched in all directions, shadowed and still, tall trees standing like silent sentinels. I called back, my voice low but steady, "Who's there?" That's when it happened. The voice answered, but it wasn't just calling my name anymore. It spoke back in my own voice. It wasn't someone else's voice trying to sound like me. It was exactly like I was speaking, perfectly mimicked, almost like an echo of myself. The whisper was so close, so clear, it sent a shock through me that tightened my chest. I sat back, pulling the tent flap closed, suddenly feeling like I was not alone. I told myself it must be my own voice playing tricks on me. The wind, maybe, or the way the forest carries sound through the trees. I've heard about those natural echoes before. Sometimes voices can bounce weirdly in the woods. But this was different. It was too exact, too deliberate. The fire flickered out, leaving only the faint silver light of the moon filtering through the branches. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The forest was alive with night sounds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig breaking somewhere nearby. But none of those made me jump like the whispering did. I called my name again, louder this time, and the voice answered with my words, exactly as I'd said them, repeating my own voice back to me. It wasn't a reply, not really. It was more like my voice trapped and thrown back at me from the dark. I shone my flashlight into the trees, spinning slowly, trying to catch sight of anyone or anything that might be hiding there. The light caught the rough bark of trees, the thick tangle of bushes, but nothing moved. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to understand what I was hearing. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, every sound suddenly sharper. Then I noticed something strange. When I moved, the voice would move too, always keeping the same distance from me, repeating what I said but delayed, like it was always just behind me, always copying. It felt like I was in a trap, like the forest itself was holding a mirror to my voice. I tried not to panic, but the unease grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not supernatural, but deeply, unnervingly wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I grabbed my pack, stuffed the tent into its bag, and started walking down the trail back to my car. The moon was behind clouds now, and the forest was darker than ever. I kept my flashlight in front of me, swinging it left and right, ears straining for any sign of footsteps or another voice. But the whispers followed me. Every time I called out, the voice returned. It didn't say anything new. It just repeated my words, always in my own voice. When I said, "Who's there?" the answer was always my own voice, exactly the same, just a few seconds later. It was like a broken tape recorder stuck in a loop. The sound echoed from every direction, but no source appeared. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was some kind of trick of the wind or the way the trees shaped sound, or maybe a prank from another camper. But I was miles from a nearest campground, and I hadn't seen anyone else all day. No footprints on the trail, no sign of another human anywhere. As I walked, I started noticing other things. My footsteps sounded different, heavier but not mine. When I glanced behind, there was nothing there. Yet the whispers were always there, matching my calls. I stopped at a small clearing and sat on a fallen log, tried to calm down. The cold air was biting in my skin, and my breath came out in small clouds. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then I realized something. The voice wasn't just copying me. It was anticipating me. Every time I hesitated, the voice would start repeating what I was about to say before I even said it. I thought maybe my brain was playing tricks, but the timing was too exact. I felt trapped in a strange kind of silence, where the forest wasn't quiet, but filled with the sound of my own voice, distorted and stretched. It was like I was being followed by a shadow of myself, a copy that could speak but had no body. The next hour was the worst. I tried to ignore the voice, but it only grew louder in the silence. I stopped talking altogether, hoping the whisper would go away if I stayed quiet. But the forest seemed to fill with a soft murmur anyway, like the sound of dozens of me whispering, calling my name from the darkness. My mind raced, looking for an explanation. I thought maybe I was overheated or dehydrated. The isolation, the stress, the long hike. Maybe I was hallucinating. I'd heard of something like that before. When your brain is pushed too far, it can create voices, repeat sounds, or make you hear things that aren't there. I forced myself to focus on the trail, putting one foot in front of the other, heading back toward the car. The whispers slowed and faded when I started moving faster, but they never stopped completely. When I finally reached the edge of the forest where the trees opened to the gravel road leading to the parking lot, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was sharp and sudden, like a door closing behind me. I looked back into the trees, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting. But there was nothing, just dark trunks and shadows. Back at my car, I sat inside, breathing hard, trying to steady my nerves. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. The next day, I talked to a ranger at the park entrance. I told him about the whispers, about the voice that sounded like me repeating everything I said. He nodded slowly, and then explained something that made everything clearer. He said the area I camped in was known for its acoustic oddities. The way the forest was shaped, the hills, The rocks, the density of the trees, could cause sounds to bounce and echo in strange ways. Sometimes, voices would carry and loop around the hills, creating what sounded like someone answering you from the woods. People sometimes thought it was a spirit or something supernatural, but it was really just nature playing tricks on sound. He told me that people had reported hearing their own voices echoed back to them, sometimes delayed, sometimes slightly distorted. It was easy to get spooked, especially at night when your mind was already on edge. He said the whispering wasn't real in the sense of a person being there. It was just sound waves bouncing back to me, carrying my own voice in a strange loop through the trees. Hearing that made me feel a little better, but it also made the whole thing feel even more eerie. It wasn't a ghost or a creature. It was just me, trapped in a strange echo chamber of my own voice. That night in the forest wasn't supernatural, but it was one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It reminded me how easily our minds can be tricked by nature when we're tired, alone, and surrounded by the unknown. The woods don't need monsters to be scary. Sometimes all it takes is your own voice coming back to you from the dark, calling your name in a whisper that sounds like you, but isn't quite right. After that, I never camped in that part of the forest again. Even now, when I think about it, I can still hear that whisper in my head, soft and close, like a shadow of myself just out of reach. The sun was low, and the sky was painted in orange and pink when I decided to take the old dirt road that led to the abandoned quarry. It wasn't really abandoned, at least not officially, but the place had been shut down for years. I had driven past it many times before, but never stopped. This time, I wanted to check it out, mostly out of boredom and curiosity. The road was narrow, rough, and full of potholes that shook the car as I rolled deeper into the quiet countryside. No one was around, and the only sounds were the tires crunching over gravel and the faint hum of insects in the air. The trees grew thick on both sides of the road, and their branches reached out like long fingers, casting long shadows over the ground. As I got closer to the quarry, the air grew cooler, and the smell of damp earth mixed with old stone filled my nose. The place had a strange feeling, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I parked my car near the old rusted gate, which was hanging off one hinge. The sign nailed to the gate was faded and cracked, warning people to stay out because it was dangerous. I stepped out and took a deep breath, feeling the cool air rush in. The ground was uneven, covered with dead leaves, small rocks, and broken branches. I walked slowly through the gate and into the open pit of the quarry. The bottom was a long way down, and the walls were jagged, carved by the machines that had torn into the earth years ago. There was a still, dark pool of water at the bottom that reflected the cloudy sky. The place was silent except for the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere deep inside. I wandered along the edge, careful with every step, feeling the loose gravel shift beneath my boots. The quarry felt like a giant wound in the land, open and raw. The air smelled sharp and cold, different from the warmer countryside around it. I looked down at the water below. It was so still and dark, it almost looked like black glass. The silence was heavy, like the place was waiting for something. After a while, I decided to climb down a narrow path that led into a small tunnel. The entrance was almost hidden by vines and fallen branches. I didn't know where the tunnel led, but it seemed worth exploring. The ground inside was damp and slippery, and the air smelled musty and old. I had to crouch low to avoid hitting my head on the low ceiling as I moved deeper into the darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the blackness, but I could see old tracks on the ground, maybe from carts or mining equipment. The walls were rough and covered in patches of moss. The sound of dripping water was louder here, echoing and bouncing off the stone. I kept moving forward, curious about what lay at the end. The tunnel turned sharply, and I stopped. My heart started to beat faster because the silence suddenly felt thick and heavy. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the forest outside anymore. The only sound was the slow drip of water from somewhere above. It felt like I was deep inside the earth, swallowed by darkness. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise like something scraping against rock. It was soft, slow, and deliberate, like someone or something was moving nearby. I froze, shining the flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything. The beam of light caught the rough walls and the wet floor, but no movement. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a loose rock falling. I kept walking, but the noise followed me, getting louder and more frequent. It wasn't the wind. It was definitely something else. My breath started to catch, and I had to force myself to keep moving. The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. I stopped at the edge, shining the light around. The chamber was huge, with high ceilings dripping with water. The floor was uneven and scattered with broken rocks and rusty pieces of old machinery. The smell was stronger here, like wet stone mixed with rust and something metallic. The scraping noise was louder too, coming from deeper inside the chamber. I moved cautiously, stepping over debris and trying not to slip on the wet stones. The noise led me toward a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber. It looked like a small crack in the rock, barely wide enough to squeeze through. I hesitated but pushed forward, squeezing through the gap. On the other side, I found myself in a smaller, darker space. The scraping noise stopped suddenly. The silence was overwhelming, so thick it almost felt physical. I held my breath and waited, listening. Nothing. Then I noticed the walls. They were covered in deep scratches, some fresh, some old. The marks looked like they had been made by claws or something sharp dragging along the stone. My skin crawled. I wanted to turn back, but I felt rooted to the spot. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and I panicked, shaking it until the beam steadied again. I moved quickly back through the narrow passage, the chamber, and into the tunnel. The silence felt like it was chasing me now. I walked faster, nearly running by the time I got back to the quarry edge. Outside, the sky had darkened to a deep blue, and the first stars were starting to appear. The trees seemed less threatening in the moonlight, and the air felt warmer again. I didn't look back as I climbed into my car, heart pounding and hands shaking. I locked the doors and started the engine, eager to leave that place behind. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the dark road stretching ahead, empty and silent. The strange feeling stayed with me, though, like the quarry had swallowed something that still followed me, waiting. Even days later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that tunnel with me. Something real and dangerous, not a ghost or fairy tale, but something alive, hidden deep beneath the earth. The kind of thing you don't see but hear just out of sight. And I knew I wouldn't go back there, not ever. The first night at the campsite, we noticed them. My wife was fixing dinner on the little camping stove while I was setting up the tent. Our two kids were running around, laughing and chasing each other in the fading daylight. The forest around us was quiet except for the birds settling in for the night and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as darkness fell, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of thick bushes, two small red dots appeared. They were glowing, almost like tiny red lanterns hanging in the dark. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the camping lantern. But the red eyes stayed fixed on us, unmoving. I nudged my wife and pointed towards the bushes. She turned, eyes wide for a moment, then smiled nervously. "Probably just a deer or a raccoon," she said. But I wasn't so sure. Those eyes didn't look like any animal I'd seen before. They were too bright, too steady. That first night, the eyes didn't come any closer. They stayed there, watching. I kept my flashlight ready, shining it toward the bushes every few minutes, but the red eyes never disappeared. They didn't blink or move, just stayed fixed on us through the dark. The kids eventually fell asleep in the tent, and we told ourselves it was nothing, just animals out in the woods. Still, I didn't sleep well. The second night, the same thing happened. As the last light disappeared from the sky, the red eyes appeared again. This time, they seemed a little closer, maybe just 10 feet from the tent's edge. I got up and shone the flashlight directly at the spot. Nothing moved, No rustling in the bushes, just those two red dots glowing at me. I called out loudly, my voice echoing through the trees, hoping to scare whatever was there away. The eyes didn't move. They didn't even blink. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the bushes from inside the tent. The kids were tired and didn't seem to notice anything. My wife told me not to worry. Maybe it's just a reflection from an animal's eyes, she said again. But the steady, unblinking glow didn't feel right. It was too intense, like something was watching us carefully. On the third night, my patience ran out. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames crackle and listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. The kids were asleep, and my wife was inside the tent. The red eyes appeared again, just like before, glowing in the bushes. This time, I stood up, walked closer, and shouted at them, my voice firm and loud. "Go away!" The eyes blinked once and then disappeared. The bushes were empty, no sound of movement, nothing. I waited, heart pounding, but they never came back that night. For the first time, I felt a small relief. In the morning, as the sun rose and light spilled over the campsite, I went outside to check around the bushes. That's when I saw the marks. Long, deep scratches were etched across the side of our cooler. The plastic ripped and gouged like some sharp claws had dug into it. My stomach turned when I found similar scratches on the fabric of our tent, running from the ground up nearly 3 feet high. It looked like something had tried to claw its way inside during the night. I called my wife over to look. She frowned, feeling the rough, torn fabric and running her fingers over the scratches on the cooler. "That's not normal," she said quietly. The kids were still asleep, so I took a closer look around the bushes, trying to find any footprints or signs of what could have made those marks. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I could see faint prints, but they were unlike any animal tracks I'd seen before. Too big and too deep, with long, sharp indentations where claws must have dug in. That day, we decided to keep a fire burning constantly and put the cooler and tent as far from the bushes as possible. I stayed alert, watching every shadow, every sound. The kids played quietly, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. That night, the red eyes didn't show up. I stayed awake until the early hours, listening to every noise. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. No rustling, no distant howls, just the crackle of the dying fire and the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. I thought maybe whatever had been watching us had finally left. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint scraping sound. I opened my eyes and looked toward the bushes. In the faint moonlight, I could just make out dark shapes moving slowly between the branches. My heart slammed to my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the movement. Nothing but shadows. The red eyes never came back that night, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Over the next couple of days, the marks on the cooler and tent got worse. Every morning, I found new scratches, deeper and wider than before. It was clear whatever was out there was growing bolder. We packed up early on the last day, tired and anxious to leave. As we loaded the car, I scanned the bushes one last time. The red eyes didn't appear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just out of sight, waiting. Driving away from the campsite, I kept thinking about those glowing eyes and the deep scratches. Whatever it wasn't a deer or raccoon. It was something bigger, something strong enough to tear through thick fabric and plastic with sharp claws. Something patient enough to watch us night after night, never making a sound, just waiting. That experience stayed with me for a long time. I can still picture those glowing red eyes, burning bright in the dark, and the silent way they disappeared when I shouted. I'm not sure what kind of animal it was, maybe a large predator like a mountain lion or bear, but something about the way it watched us felt different, more curious, more deliberate. We've camped since then, but never near thick bushes or forest edges like that. And I always check the shadows before I close my eyes, just in case those red eyes are still out there somewhere, waiting in the dark. The canyon was deeper and quieter than I ever imagined it would be. I had picked this spot for one reason. I needed to be alone. After my mom died 6 months ago, everything felt like it was falling apart, and I thought maybe if I got away from people, away from noise, I could find a little peace. The canyon was remote, surrounded by steep rock walls, with a small stream running through the bottom. It was the kind of place where you could hear yourself think, or at least that's what I told myself. I arrived just before sunset, hauling my backpack and camping gear over the rocky path that wound down into the canyon floor. The air was dry and still, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the scrub brush. I found a flat area near the stream, set up my small tent, and started a fire. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. The first night was peaceful. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the water and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. It was the kind of quiet that almost makes you feel like you're part of the canyon itself. But then, as the night deepened, I heard something else. At first, it was barely there, just a soft whisper like the wind shifting through the rocks. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. My name, whispered. A voice calling my name, soft but unmistakable. I froze. I listened hard, eyes wide open in the dark tent. The voice didn't say anything else, just my name over and over. The sound wasn't loud, but it was close enough to make me shiver. It was the kind of whisper that felt like it was right next to your ear. The strange thing was that it sounded exactly like my mom's voice. I know because I had heard her whisper my name hundreds of times before she died. I wanted to tell myself it was just the wind or the canyon playing tricks on sound, but it didn't feel like that. I tried to brush it off and went to sleep, though my heart was pounding. The next day, I spent most of it hiking and trying not to think about the voice. When night came again, the whispering started once more. This time, it was louder, almost like it was coming from all around me. I couldn't see anyone, and there was no way anyone else was out here. The canyon was too far from the trailhead, and I had made sure to pick a spot where no one else would be camping. Each night after that, the whispering got louder and clearer. It never said anything but my name. No words, no sentences, just my name over and over, sometimes slow, sometimes faster, sometimes with a slight pause like someone was catching their breath. The voice always sounded like my mom, but something about it was wrong, too urgent, too strained. I stopped trying to sleep. I stayed awake, listening, trying to figure out if it was an animal or something natural. The canyon was full of animals, rattlesnakes, coyotes, owls, but none of them made a sound like that. I checked my tent every night for signs that someone was out there, but there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no shadows. I started keeping my flashlight ready and carrying my pocket knife with me even inside the tent. I was scared, sure, but more than that, I was confused and tired. I told myself maybe it was my mind, that I was hearing what I wanted or expected. Maybe I was losing it. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to find where the voice was coming from. I unzipped my tent quietly, careful not to make a sound, and stepped out into the moonlight. The canyon looked different at night, bigger, darker, and endless. The stream glistened under the moon, and the air was cold and sharp. I called out softly, "Mom," but there was no answer. Only the whispering started again, louder than ever. It was everywhere now, bouncing off the canyon walls, sounding like it came from all directions. I followed the sound, moving slowly and carefully along the edge of the stream, scanning the rocks and trees. I reached a small clearing where the canyon walls narrowed, and there I saw it. A thin, jagged crack in the rock face, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The whispering was coming from inside the crack, muffled but clear. My heart pounded in my chest. I shone my flashlight into the crack, but it was too narrow to see much. I thought about calling for help, but knew no one was close enough to hear me. I had to be brave and find out what was inside. I reached in with my hand, feeling the cool, rough stone. Then I pulled out an old tape recorder. It was dusty and looked like it had been there for years. I wiped it off and saw that it still had batteries inside. On the tape, someone had recorded a voice repeatedly saying my name. It was a loop. My mom's voice, clear and steady, saying only my name. I felt a rush of emotion, relief, confusion, sadness. Someone had been here before me, or maybe recently. I had been hearing this recording playing hidden in the rocks, carried by the canyon wind and echoing off the walls. I spent the next day exploring the canyon and the trails around it, try to figure out who had left the recorder. I found no campsites or signs of recent visitors, but I did find an old ranger station abandoned for years. Inside, there were dusty boxes and old equipment. One box had the same tape recorder brand. It looked like a lost or forgotten item from some previous visitor or ranger. I realized the whispering wasn't supernatural or anything strange. It was a machine playing a recording, hidden and weathered, that the wind carried into the canyon every night. The tape had been stuck on repeat, and the sound bounced between the rocks, making it seem like the voice was everywhere. That night, for the first time since I arrived, I slept without hearing my name whispered through the dark. I turned off the recorder and packed it with me. I left the canyon with a strange feeling, part relief, part sadness. It was a strange comfort to know the voice was real, but not from my mom. It was a memory trapped on a tape, stuck in time, hidden in a place where no one would ever find it. When I got home, I kept the tape recorder. Sometimes I play it back. The voice still calls my name, soft and steady. It's no longer scary. It reminds me that sometimes our minds try to hold on to what's lost, and sometimes the answers are quieter than we expect. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get scared while camping. I've been out in the woods alone plenty of times before, hiking, sleeping in a tent, cooking over a fire, and just enjoying the quiet. The forest always felt peaceful, even comforting. But this trip, the one I took last fall, changed all that. I picked a small state park that was known for being quiet and not too crowded. It was late September, early fall. The nights were chilly, with that crispness that makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter. The trees had started to turn orange and yellow, but most were still green. The park had only a few campsites open, and I ended up at the back end of the loop, where the woods were thick and the sounds of other campers were distant and faint. The perfect spot, I thought. I arrived mid-afternoon, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent on a flat patch just off a dirt road. The ground was covered with pine needles and dry leaves. There was a small creek maybe 50 yards away, and the sun filtered through the canopy in soft golden light. The air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke from other campers' fires. I was alone as I had planned. No phone signal, no internet, just me in the woods. The first night was quiet. I cooked some instant soup on my little stove, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and listened to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs from squirrels or raccoons. I didn't hear anything unusual, just the natural noises you expect in the woods. I fell asleep easily. Then, on the second night, around 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise, just a faint rustling sound near the tent flap. I lay very still, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the tent. Maybe a small animal trying to get close, looking for food. But when I opened my eyes and looked toward the flap, the movement stopped. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the slight flutter of the fabric. I kept my eyes on the flap for a while, but there was nothing more. I eventually drifted back to sleep, convincing myself I was just being jumpy. The next day, I thought about what had happened. I checked the campsite, looked around for signs of animals or people. No footprints near the tent flap, no broken branches, nothing out of place. The park was supposed to be safe. I told myself it was nothing. The third night, it happened again. At almost exactly 2 a.m., the tent flap rustled as if someone was peeking inside. I froze. I sat up slowly, my eyes locked on the moving fabric. The moon was behind some clouds, so I couldn't see clearly, but the outline of the tent flap shifted as if being pushed lightly. Still, no figure, no shadow, nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it toward the flap, and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty ground just outside the tent. Nothing. No one was there. I stayed awake for a long time after that, waiting for something to happen, but it never did. The next day, I told myself to stay alert. I thought maybe a curious person was wandering near the camp after hours. I was alone and didn't want anyone sneaking up on me or trying to mess with me. The fourth night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again to the sound of the tent flap moving. This time, it wasn't just a little rustle. It sounded like someone was pushing it open slowly, deliberately. My heart slammed against my chest. I grabbed my small pocket knife that I kept near my sleeping bag and sat up fully. I looked toward the opening. The flap was moving, and then I saw it, barely, but the flap was wide open, the dark night outside spilling into the tent. I quickly shone my flashlight toward the opening. The breeze had pushed the flap back, but there was still no one there. I stood up slowly, keeping my knife in hand, and looked around my small tent. No sign of anyone. The moon had come out from behind the clouds and lit the forest floor outside. I stepped out carefully to look around, checking the perimeter of my sight. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. I shut the flap tightly, zipped it closed, and went back inside, locking the tent poles in place the best I could. The next day, I searched more carefully around the campsite. I looked for tracks, scuffed dirt, anything. I found some deer tracks and a few raccoon prints near my cooler, but no human footprints. It didn't make sense. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the flashlight and knife close. I stayed awake until almost 3 a.m., but nothing moved outside the tent. The fifth night was when things got really strange. I had just fallen asleep when I heard the flap again. I woke up fully, heart pounding. This time, the flap wasn't just rustling. It was wide open. The cold night air blew inside, and I could see the trees silhouetted against the moonlight. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight. I scanned the ground inside the tent and spotted something lying near my sleeping bag. It was a photo. I picked it up slowly and shone the flashlight on it. It was a picture of me sleeping inside the tent. The photo was taken from the inside. I was curled up on my side, eyes closed, unaware. I dropped the photo in shock and looked around frantically. The flap was wide open, and someone had clearly been inside the tent while I slept. I froze. My mind raced. How could someone get inside without me hearing? I hadn't noticed any sounds except the flap. I'd slept deeply until the noise woke me. I zipped the tent closed as fast as I could, but now the feeling of safety was gone. I sat in the dark, clutching the photo, thinking about who could have done this. There was no one camping close enough to explain it. The park was nearly empty, and I hadn't heard anyone walking near me after dark. The thought that someone had been so close, watching me sleep, terrified me. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but it was still the middle of the night. I didn't want to walk alone in the dark through the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife, flashlight, and the photo. When dawn finally came, I packed up as fast as I could. I double-checked everything, stuffed the photo in my backpack, and hurried down the dirt road toward the park exit. On the way out, I thought about calling the park rangers, but I wasn't sure what I could say. They might think I was crazy. I didn't have proof besides the photo, and I didn't know who could have done it or why. Back home, I developed the photo to see if it gave me any clues. The quality wasn't great. It looked like it was taken on a phone camera with low light, but I could make out the shape of someone's hand holding the phone near the flap of the tent. I looked closely at the shadows and edges and spotted a faint outline near the tent's opening. It was someone crouching just outside, their face hidden behind the tent fabric. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident or a prank. Someone had been stalking me in the woods. They had slipped in and out of my campsite quietly every night around the same time, taking pictures, watching me sleep, and disappearing without a sound. I never went back to that park. I reported the incident to the park authorities and the local police. They said they would increase patrols at night, but they never found who did it. I kept the photo, a reminder that out in the woods, no matter how safe it feels, there can be someone watching. Since then, I've learned to trust my instincts more, to camp where others can hear or see me, and to always keep my gear close. The woods can be peaceful, but sometimes the quiet hides things far more unsettling than animals or the wind. The sun was already low when I pulled into the campground. It was late April, the kind of time when most people weren't thinking about camping yet. The place was nearly empty, just a few scattered trailers and tents, all spaced far apart like they didn't expect company. I liked it that way. I wanted quiet, space, and time to think, not a crowded party or a noisy RV park. The air had that fresh, woodsy smell, a mix of pine, damp earth, and the faint scent of campfires long gone cold. I parked my car next to a small dirt loop, the one spot that looked decent enough to set up. The ground was a little dry, but still soft, covered with a thin layer of pine needles and leaves from last fall. I unloaded my backpack, unfolded my little tent, and started setting up. It was slow work, but I didn't mind. There was no rush. As I hammered in the tent stakes, I noticed an older woman walking along the loop. She was about my age's grandmother, maybe early 70s, with thin gray hair tucked under a faded baseball cap. She wore a thick green jacket even though the temperature was mild, and her jeans looked well worn. She carried a small thermos in one hand. She stopped near me, smiling gently. I nodded and gave a small smile back. She didn't say anything right away, just watched me work on the tent with a quiet patience. After a moment, she spoke, her voice low and calm, like she'd spent a lot of time outdoors and learned to keep things simple. She told me she was the camp host and that the campground was mostly empty because it was still early in the season. I didn't expect much company, she said. She gave me a few tips on where to find the best firewood and which trails were good for a quick walk. Then she offered me some coffee from her thermos. I wasn't sure if I should take it, but something in her tone was kind and easy, so I said yes. We sat on the old wooden bench by the picnic table near the road, sharing the coffee quietly. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed me more than the temperature outside. She talked a little about the area, how the forest had changed over the years, about the animals people used to see around here. It wasn't a long conversation, more like a slow, easy exchange of words between two people who didn't really know each other but weren't strangers either. I felt calm, like maybe this was what camping should be, peaceful, simple, without the rush or the distractions. When I thanked her and went back to my tent, I thought maybe I'd found a good spot to stay the night. As darkness fell, the air cooled quickly. I built a small fire with some dry pine branches I'd gathered, careful not to make it too big. The crackle and pop of the flames mixed with the distant sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, a bird's occasional call, the wind brushing through the trees. The stars came out one by one, sharp and bright in the clear sky. I cooked some canned chili on a small stove, then sat back to watch the fire, feeling the kind of tired satisfaction that comes after a day spent outside. The campground was still quiet. I heard the occasional car from a nearby road, faint and far away, but otherwise, nothing. Before heading to bed, I decided to walk around a little just to stretch my legs. The older woman's spot, where she'd sat with the thermos, was just a few campsites down. I figured I'd thank her again for the coffee and say goodnight. But when I reached the place where she had been, something fell off. The grass there wasn't green or brown like the rest of the campground. It was blackened and dry, like it had been burnt. The picnic table was gone. The bench was just a pile of charred wood splinters. I stood there for a moment, confused. I'd just been there a couple of hours ago, hadn't I? The fire she'd used to keep warm couldn't have burned the whole spot down so fast, could it? I looked around for any signs of a fire, maybe a smoldering ember or a cigarette, but nothing. Just dry, dead grass and ash. The quiet felt heavier, like the air itself was thicker. My skin crawled, and my heart started beating faster. I went back to my tent quickly, locked the zipper, and sat down, trying to make sense of it. I kept thinking about the woman. How could she have been there if that spot had been burnt? Why was there no evidence anyone else was here? No sign of her car or campsite. The next morning, I drove into town, curious to ask about the campground. At the small local store, I talked to the owner, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd spent his whole life in the area. I asked about the camp host, about when the campground usually opened, and if there was someone who managed it. He looked at me funny, then shook his head. "No host here for over a year," he said. "Campground been closed off and mostly empty, except for a few people like you who show up now and then. Maybe some vandals or campers passing through, but no official host." I told him about the woman, the coffee, the tips. He frowned, said he hadn't heard of anyone working as a host recently. He offered to call the Forest Service office to check, but the answer was the same. No host had been assigned. Back at the campground, I looked again at the burned spot, feeling a chill despite the morning sun. The bench was just ashes, No sign anyone had been there recently. I packed up, leaving quickly, not wanting to stay in a place that suddenly felt strange and unsafe. The whole thing stuck with me for weeks. That quiet camp, the old woman who was supposed to be the host, the coffee she gave me, and the burned patch of grass that told a different story. It wasn't a ghost story or some legend. It was real, but it didn't make sense. Maybe she was someone who wandered through the woods, or maybe she was a story my mind made up to feel less alone. Whatever it was a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hold the strangest secrets, and some things are better left unexplained. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. It was late summer, and the air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. Just me, some quiet time away from the city, and the chance to clear my head. The spot wasn't far off the trail, but far enough that I wouldn't get bothered by other campers or hikers. The sun was dipping low behind the trees as I finished pitching my tent, and the sky turned a soft orange pink. Right near my campsite stood a single dead tree. It looked out of place among all the green and life around it. Its bark was dry and cracked, and its branches stuck out like crooked fingers, bare and lifeless. I hadn't noticed it much when I first arrived, but now, with the fading light, it gave me a weird feeling, like it was watching. I shook the thought off and went about getting a fire going. That first night, I laid in my sleeping bag, the fire crackling softly outside my tent flap. I was half listening to the sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, when I noticed a faint sound coming from the direction of the dead tree. It was soft at first, like a distant buzz, almost like the static you hear when a TV or radio isn't tuned right. The sound wasn't constant, but it came and went in short bursts. Curious, I zipped open my tent and looked towards a tree. The night was dark but clear, and the moonlight made the bare branches stand out sharply. The static noise wasn't loud enough to be more than a whisper in the quiet forest, but it definitely came from near the tree. I sat up for a while, trying to figure out what was causing it. There were no wires or any kind of electronics around. I thought maybe it was just my imagination or the way the wind was moving through the dead branches, but the sound was too consistent and clear to be just wind. Over the next few nights, the static noise became a strange routine. Each night, around the same time, the buzzing would start near the tree. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice. Phones and radios I brought with me would glitch and buzz if I held them close to the tree. Once, I even tried tuning my small handheld radio while standing near it. The static got so loud and harsh that the radio lost signal completely and shut off. I didn't bring much technology with me to begin with, just my phone and that radio for emergencies. Both worked fine when I moved away from the tree, but when I went back, they acted like they were being jammed. I thought maybe it was some kind of strange interference from the environment, solar activity, or a nearby transmitter I didn't know about. The forest was pretty remote, but I couldn't be sure. On the fourth night, something happened that shook me. I'd been watching the dead tree again, sitting by my fire. The static was there as usual, that low, crackling sound. I felt a strange pull towards the tree, like it was drawing me in. Against my better judgment, I stood up and walked closer. The closer I got, the louder the static became. It was almost painful in my ears. I reached out and touched the rough bark. The moment my palm pressed against the tree, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground about 20 feet away from the tree, my palms stinging and soaked with blood. I looked down and saw deep scrapes and cuts across my hands, like I'd been dragged or clawed. I checked my pockets and found a chunk of bark, roughly the size of a fist, covered in my blood. At first, I panicked, trying to remember what had happened. I didn't feel any injuries besides my hands. No bruises or cuts on my arms or legs. No bumps on my head. It was like I had just blacked out and moved without knowing it. I crawled back to my tent, heart racing, trying to make sense of it all. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, hands wrapped in cloth to stop the bleeding, watching the dead tree. The static noise was back, but quieter now, almost like it was waiting for something. I felt sick, but more than that, I felt a deep unease, like whatever was in that tree wasn't natural. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird environmental effect or a natural phenomenon I didn't understand. The next morning, I inspected the chunk of bark I found. It was dry and rough, and I could see tiny black specks in the wood, almost like burnt resin. There were no signs of insects or fungus, just old dead wood. I wondered if maybe something inside the tree had caused my blackout, like a chemical or a toxin, but I felt fine otherwise, no dizziness or nausea. I packed up my gear that day, deciding to leave. The place didn't feel safe anymore. But before I left, I did one last thing. I walked over to the tree, keeping my distance this time, and scanned the area carefully. On the ground around the base, I noticed faint scratches in the dirt. Not from an animal, but from something sharp, almost like claw marks. They weren't deep, but they were too regular to be random. The marks formed a rough circle around the tree, about 10 feet out. I backed away slowly. The sun was rising, and the forest was waking up. Birds started singing, and the air warmed up with morning light. I didn't look back as I hiked out of the clearing, the feeling in my gut telling me this was one thing I wasn't meant to figure out. Since then, I haven't camped anywhere near that spot or any dead trees like it. The static sound, the blackout, and the blood on my hands felt like a warning. Something about that tree was wrong. Something that messed with my mind and body in ways I can't explain. Maybe it was a rare natural phenomenon, maybe something else, but whatever it was, I don't want to find out what happens if I touch it again. I tell people about it now, trying to make sense of it myself, but I've never heard of anything like it, and no one believes me. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear a faint crackle in my ear, like static from a TV left on too long. And I wonder if that tree is still out there, waiting for the next person to come too close. The first night we arrived at the trailhead, we met a couple of locals who warned us about something strange in the forest. They said if we heard whistling at night, we should never answer it. They didn't say why, just that it was dangerous. We laughed it off. None of us believed in ghost stories or weird warnings. We were there to hike, camp, and enjoy the wild, not to get spooked by some old tale. But that night, everything changed. We set up our tents in a small clearing deep inside the forest, far from the parking lot and the noisy highway. The trees stood tall and thick around us, their leaves rustling in the soft night breeze. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. The moon was bright, but hidden behind clouds, so the forest was mostly dark. We built a small fire, cooked some food, and talked quietly as the flames flickered. Our laughter echoed faintly between the trees. After we all crawled into our tents, the forest grew still except for the occasional crack of a twig or the distant call of an owl. The silence was heavy, almost like it was listening. Around midnight, I heard it, soft at first like a faint wind, but then clearer, a high-pitched whistle. It was so strange because the wind wasn't blowing that hard, and the sound was too sharp, too deliberate. "Did you hear that?" I whispered through the tent wall. My friend Mark, who shared the tent with me, smiled and said, "Probably just some bird or a breeze. Nothing to worry about." But the whistling came again, this time from the trees closer to our camp. It wasn't a melody, just a sharp, slow whistle that seemed to pause and start again, like someone was breathing it out in short bursts. The others heard it too. Tom, Sarah, and Jess peeked out from their tents, trying to catch where the sound was coming from. None of us said much. It was eerie. We all remembered the locals' warning, but still shrugged it off. Then Mark, just to joke around, whistled back once, loud and clear. The moment he did, the forest fell completely silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just a heavy quiet that felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. We all froze. Then the whistling started again, this time slower and closer, almost like it was right outside our tents. We couldn't see anyone or anything, but the whistle was sharper and louder, moving around us in the dark. The next day, we told ourselves it was just a coincidence, maybe some animal or a prank by other hikers. But that night, it got worse. The whistle didn't just come and go. It came closer and closer, circling our camp. It wasn't just one whistle anymore. It was a series of whistles, short, long, quick, slow, like someone was trying to get our attention. And then we heard it. Softly but clearly, a whistle that sounded like someone tried to mimic the rhythm of our names. Marque, Marque, Sarah, Sarah. It was impossible. No animal could do that. No person would risk sneaking that close in the dark, especially in the forest. Mark was the first to lose his nerve. He said we should pack up and leave, but we didn't want to believe what was happening. We tried to ignore it, but every few minutes, the whistle came back. Each time closer, each time more precise. The nights after that, the whistler got bolder. We kept hearing the soft whistle right outside our tents. Sometimes, it would pause just long enough for us to catch a breath before it started mimicking our names again. We tried to call out, "Who's there?" but all we got was the whistle in reply, perfectly mimicking the sound of our voices. One night, Mark decided to prove he wasn't scared. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The moment he opened his tent flap, the whistle stopped. Not just stopped, it cut off like a switch was flipped. The forest was dead silent, except for the crackle of our campfire. Mark shone his light around, but he didn't see a thing. No movement, no shadows, nothing but trees and darkness. He called out again, louder this time, "Come on, show yourself." Nothing. Then, just as he turned to go back inside, the whistle came again, directly behind him, sharp and clear. Mark spun around fast, swinging the flashlight beam wildly, but still no one was there. After that, we all agreed we couldn't stay. The whistling wasn't just a sound. It was something watching us, testing us, messing with us. It wasn't random. It was too deliberate. It knew our names. It knew where we were. We packed our gear quietly in the dark, not daring to make noise. Every whistle felt closer, almost like it was right at the edge of our tents, waiting for us to run. As we left the forest, the whistling stopped abruptly, like it had lost interest. We didn't look back. Later, when we told the locals, they only nodded. They said the forest held many secrets, and the whistling was a warning, a way to keep people from lingering too long or going off the trail. We never went back, and I don't think I'll ever hear a whistle the same way again. It's not just a sound out here, it's a message. When you don't answer, the first night at the campsite, we noticed them. My wife was fixing dinner on the little camping stove while I was setting up the tent. Our two kids were running around, laughing and chasing each other in the fading daylight. The forest around us was quiet except for the birds settling in for the night and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as darkness fell, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of thick bushes, two small red dots appeared. They were glowing, almost like tiny red lanterns hanging in the dark. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the camping lantern. But the red eyes stayed fixed on us, unmoving. I nudged my wife and pointed towards the bushes. She turned, eyes wide for a moment, then smiled nervously. "Probably just a deer or a raccoon," she said. But I wasn't so sure. Those eyes didn't look like any animal I'd seen before. They were too bright, too steady. That first night, the eyes didn't come any closer. They stayed there, watching. I kept my flashlight ready, shining it towards the bushes every few minutes, but the red eyes never disappeared. They didn't blink or move, just stayed fixed on us through the dark. The kids eventually fell asleep in the tent, and we told ourselves it was nothing, just animals out in the woods. Still, I didn't sleep well. The second night, the same thing happened. As the last light disappeared from the sky, the red eyes appeared again. This time, they seemed a little closer, maybe just 10 feet from the tent's edge. I got up and shone the flashlight directly at the spot. Nothing moved, no rustling in the bushes, just those two red dots glowing at me. I called out loudly, my voice echoing through the trees, hoping to scare whatever was their way. The eyes didn't move. They didn't even blink. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the bushes from inside the tent. The kids were tired and didn't seem to notice anything. My wife told me not to worry. "Maybe it's just a reflection from an animal's eyes," she said again. But the steady, unblinking glow didn't feel right. It was too intense, like something was watching us carefully. On the third night, my patience ran out. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames crackle and listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. The kids were asleep, and my wife was inside the tent. The red eyes appeared again, just like before, glowing in the bushes. This time, I stood up, walked closer, and shouted at them, my voice firm and loud. "Go away!" The eyes blinked once and then disappeared. The bushes were empty, no sound of movement, nothing. I waited, heart pounding, but they never came back that night. For the first time, I felt a small relief. In the morning, as the sun rose and light spilled over the campsite, I went outside to check around the bushes. That's when I saw the marks. Long, deep scratches were etched across the side of our cooler. The plastic ripped and gouged like some sharp claws had dug into it. My stomach turned when I found similar scratches on the fabric of our tent, running from the ground up nearly 3 feet high. It looked like something had tried to claw its way inside during the night. I called my wife over to look. She frowned, feeling the rough, torn fabric and running her fingers over the scratches on the cooler. "That's not normal," she said quietly. The kids were still asleep, so I took a closer look around the bushes, trying to find any footprints or signs of what could have made those marks. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I could see faint prints, but they were unlike any animal tracks I'd seen before. Too big and too deep, with long, sharp indentations where claws must have dug in. That day, we decided to keep a fire burning constantly and put the cooler and tent as far from the bushes as possible. I stayed alert, watching every shadow, every sound. The kids played quietly, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. That night, the red eyes didn't show up. I stayed awake until the early hours, listening to every noise. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. No rustling, no distant howls, just the crackle of the dying fire and the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. I thought maybe whatever had been watching us had finally left. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint scraping sound. I opened my eyes and looked toward the bushes. In the faint moonlight, I could just make out dark shapes moving slowly between the branches. My heart slammed to my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the movement. Nothing but shadows. The red eyes never came back that night, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Over the next couple of days, the marks on the cooler and tent got worse. Every morning, I found new scratches, deeper and wider than before. It was clear whatever was out there was growing bolder. We packed up early on the last day, tired and anxious to leave. As we loaded the car, I scanned the bushes one last time. The red eyes didn't appear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just out of sight, waiting. Driving away from the campsite, I kept thinking about those glowing eyes and the deep scratches. Whatever it wasn't a deer or raccoon. It was something bigger, something strong enough to tear through thick fabric and plastic with sharp claws. Something patient enough to watch us night after night, never making a sound, just waiting. That experience stayed with me for a long time. I can still picture those glowing red eyes, burning bright in the dark, and the silent way they disappeared when I shouted. I'm not sure what kind of animal it was, maybe a large predator like a mountain lion or bear, but something about the way it watched us felt different, more curious, more deliberate. We've camped since then, but never near thick bushes or forest edges like that. And I always check the shadows before I close my eyes, just in case those red eyes are still out there somewhere, waiting in the dark. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet getaway. I found it online, a small place deep in the woods, far from anything. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, just nature and silence. It sounded perfect. I needed a break from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic. Just a few days alone, some fresh air, and maybe a good hike. I told myself I'd take my time, slow down, and enjoy the peace. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow, twisting, and lined with tall pines that blocked most of the sky. The air smelled like pine needles and wet earth. It was cool, early fall, and the leaves were just starting to turn. Yellow and orange mixed with green, the forest looked alive and quiet at the same time. The cabin was small, built from old logs that had darkened with age. It sat on a slight rise, looking out over a clearing where the grass had grown long and wild. A small porch wrapped around the front, the wood creaking under my feet as I stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and something faintly like old smoke. The fireplace was stone, big and old, with ashes still in the hearth. The floor was rough wood, scratched and worn. The furniture was sparse, a table and a couple of chairs, a small bed pushed into a corner, and a metal stove for cooking. I dropped my pack and opened a window to let in fresh air. The sun was nearly gone now, and the forest outside grew darker, the shadows thickening. I could hear the wind in the trees, a soft but steady sound, and far off the occasional bird call. No cars, no voices, just nature. I unpacked a few things, a book, some food, and my flashlight. I lit the stove and made a simple meal, the warm glow filling the room. Outside, the wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves and making the cabin creak softly. It wasn't cold yet, but I added some wood to the fire just in case. After eating, I sat by the window, watching as the forest grew darker. The last light faded quickly, replaced by deep blue shadows. The stars started to appear, small pinpricks of light scattered across the sky. It was beautiful and peaceful. I thought about how far away I was from everything. No distractions, no noise, just the woods and me. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The bed was stiff and not very comfortable, but it was warm enough. I left the fire burning low in the stove, the glow barely lighting the room. Outside, the wind sounded stronger now, whistling through the trees and pushing branches against the cabin walls. It was the kind of night that felt alive, like the forest was breathing around me. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise seemed louder in the dark. The creak of the wood, the scrape of branches, the snap of twigs. I kept thinking I heard something moving just outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind and my imagination. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees, casting long beams of light across the floor. I made coffee on the stove and ate a quick breakfast. Outside, the forest looked calm and bright, the air fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I decided to take a hike to stretch my legs. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, and my phone, though I knew there was no signal, and headed out. The trail was narrow and rough, winding through the trees and up a small hill. The ground was soft and covered with fallen leaves. I walked slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest, birds, squirrels, the rustle of the wind. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns on ground. About an hour in, I came to a small stream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I knelt to take a drink and rested for a moment, watching the water flow. The forest was still, almost too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the sound of the stream and the wind in the leaves. It felt peaceful, but there was also something strange about the silence. I stood up and continued on the trail, but as I walked, I noticed the trees looked different. The bark was rougher, the branches twisted in odd shapes. The light was dimmer here, the forest thicker and darker. The path narrowed and became harder to follow. I kept going, telling myself I'd turn back soon. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was soft, like a footstep on dry leaves. I stopped and listened. The forest was quiet again. I took a few steps forward, then the noise came again, closer this time. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I started walking faster, heart pounding. The trail became less clear, covered with sticks and leaves. I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt and rocks, and I tasted blood. I sat up, breathing hard, and looked around. The forest seemed darker, the trees closing in. I stood up and decided to head back. The noise came again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was a low rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes reflecting the light, but when I blinked, they were gone. I started running, following the trail as best as I could. The wind whipped through the branches, and the sound of the rustling got louder, chasing me. My legs ached. My breath came fast and shallow. I didn't look back. I just kept running. After what felt like forever, I broke through the trees and saw the clearing where the cabin sat. The porch light was still on, the small fire burning in the stove, glowing warmly through the window. I stumbled up the steps and locked the door behind me. Inside, I leaned against the door, panting and sweating. My hand was shaking. I looked out the window, but the forest was quiet again. No rustling, no movement, just the wind in the trees. I checked the locks and closed all the windows. I grabbed a knife from my pack, something sharp and heavy, and sat by the fire. The night stretched on slowly, each minute feeling longer than the last. I kept listening, waiting for any sound. Around midnight, the wind died down. The forest outside was still and silent. I felt myself relax a little, but I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful, just like before. No sign of anything strange. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin that morning. The drive back was quiet. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by cars and noise. The city felt loud and overwhelming, but safe. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of the night stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the silence that wasn't really silence, the strange rustling in the dark. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just the wild, unpredictable forest. And sometimes, that's more frightening than anything else. I remember when my partner and I decided to take a break from the city noise and booked a cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. We were both exhausted from work and thought a few days away in nature would help us relax. The place was supposed to be perfect, isolated, surrounded by tall trees, with no neighbors for miles. The kind of spot where you could hear nothing but the wind and the sound of wildlife. We packed everything we thought we'd need, drove hours out of town, and finally arrived as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, made mostly of rough, dark wood, with a small porch and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. It was quiet except for the creaks and groans of the timber settling. Inside, the air smelled like damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe old pine mixed with dust. We unpacked quickly, lit the fireplace, and cooked a simple dinner on the small stove. Outside, the forest pressed in thick and dark. That first night, after we finished eating and settled in with some blankets on the couch, I thought I heard something strange. At first, it was just a faint noise like the wind moving through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. It was soft, almost like whispering. I mentioned it to my partner, but they just shrugged and said it was probably the wind or the old cabin making noises. Still, the sound didn't quite feel right. It wasn't the usual creaks or the way trees shift in the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. As the night went on, the temperature dropped. The fire died down to glowing embers, and the cabin felt colder than it should have been. That's when the whispers got louder. I swear, it sounded like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart started beating faster, and I kept glancing toward the walls, half expecting to see someone standing there. My partner was calm, trying to reassure me, but I could tell they were uneasy too. The whispers changed as the hours passed. They went from quiet murmurs to clearer voices calling out. I could hear my name being said, sometimes soft and pleading like someone begging for help, and other times sharp and angry like a yell cutting through the cold night air. It was chilling. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark, but my partner heard it too. We both sat frozen on the couch, listening as the voices seemed to circle around the room. I remember the walls themselves felt alive, almost vibrating with the sound. Every wooden plank seemed to pulse with the voices. I stood up and walked around, tapping the walls, trying to find where the sound was coming from, but it wasn't any one place. It felt like the entire cabin was speaking. The temperature kept dropping, and the whispers got more urgent, desperate even. We huddled together, the fire barely glowing, trying to block out the voices. When morning came, I was relieved to see daylight. But then we had another problem. Our car wouldn't start. We tried everything, checking the battery, turning the key over and over, but the engine just wouldn't catch. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was miles away. We were stuck. That's when the voices got worse. By midday, the whispers turned into loud voices crying out in pain and frustration. It wasn't just inside the cabin anymore. It felt like the whole forest was echoing them back at us. It was exhausting, terrifying. I could barely think. My partner suggested we try to leave on foot and hike out to the nearest road, but the forest was dense and unfamiliar. It was late in the afternoon when we decided to break one of the cabin windows to get some fresh air and try to cool our nerves. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and the voices instantly stopped. The silence was almost more frightening. We looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened. We didn't know why breaking the window changed things, but the weight in the air lifted a little. We carefully climbed out and decided to make a plan to walk to the road and find help. Later, when we finally got back to town and had cell service, I started researching the cabin. I found some old newspaper articles that mentioned a family who had lived on the land where the cabin was built. Decades ago, they had disappeared without a trace. No bodies were ever found, and no clear explanation was given. The story said their voices were rumored to still echo in the area. The family's last desperate calls trapped inside the wooden soil. I don't believe in ghosts or fairy tales, but what we heard was real. It was the kind of thing that doesn't make sense, but stays with you, a chilling reminder of something lost and forgotten. The cabin was more than just old wood and nails. It was a vessel for something that time couldn't erase. Voices caught between the past and the present. We never went back, and every time I think about that weekend, I still hear those whispers in my mind, calling out from the walls of that cabin deep in the woods. The winter had set in hard and fast by the time I arrived at the cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road or town. The snow was already knee-deep when I pulled up the last stretch of the dirt path in my truck. It was the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones and made the air feel sharp, almost like it could cut through your clothes. I'd chosen this cabin because it was isolated, a place to get away from the noise and people. A week alone with no distractions, just me and the silence of the forest. I thought I was ready for it. The cabin itself was a small, weathered building built decades ago and holding tight against the harsh winter. The wood was rough, stained dark by years of storms and snow, but sturdy. I liked that about it. There was a little porch out front, half buried in snow, and a single window on the side with frost creeping in along the edges of the glass. Inside, it was modest but comfortable. A small wood stove sat in the corner, a heavy metal box that was supposed to keep the place warm. There was a cot with a thin mattress, a small table, and a handful of basic supplies left by the owner. I brought my own food and extra firewood, but for the first night, I planned to use what was already here. The first evening went smoothly enough. I chopped some wood and stacked it near the stove, then got a fire going. The crackling flames brought a warmth that pushed back the chill in the room. I sat near the stove with a cup of coffee, watching the flames flicker against the wooden walls. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, coating the trees and ground in thick white layers. The wind picked up, howling through the forest like a living thing. It was beautiful and haunting all at once. I felt a deep, kind of calm settle in me. Out here, I thought no one could bother me. No one would. I slept deeply that night. The cold kept at bay by the fire. But the next morning, when I woke up to a gray light filtering through the frost on the window, I noticed something strange. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, but on the porch, there were footprints. Fresh footprints, clear and sharp against the white, leading up to the back door. I froze. The snow had been falling hard all night, thick enough to cover anything that wasn't new, and these prints were crisp, as if made just hours ago. I stepped outside slowly, boots crunching in the snow. The footprints were large, definitely not mine. They trailed from the woods, straight to the back door, then stopped. There was no sign of any return path, no footprints heading back the way they came. It was like someone had come, stood at the door, and vanished. My heart pounded hard as I checked the door. It was locked from the inside. I had double-checked all the locks before I went to bed. I never left the door unlocked. The windows were shut tight, no signs of forced entry anywhere. I tested the locks again. They were secure. No way anyone had come inside without me knowing. I looked around the yard. The snow continued to fall, thick and soft, muffling all sound. The footprints ended abruptly at the door. I stared at them, feeling a cold dread wash over me. Someone or something had been outside my cabin in the middle of a heavy snowstorm, watching me. But why? And how? I went back inside and checked the fireplace. The ashes were cold. No sign the fire had been touched overnight. If someone had been inside, they would have had to build a fire to warm up or stay. But the fire was out, cold as ice. No sign of any disturbance inside the cabin. I moved cautiously around the room, searching for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. The table was undisturbed, the bed untouched. No footprints inside, no marks on the floor. It was as if the person had simply disappeared from outside, right at the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The closest neighbor was at least 5 miles away, and no one else was supposed to be anywhere near this part of the forest. The snow was heavy, and the storm had made the roads impassable. Nobody could have just walked up here without me hearing or seeing them before. I checked my phone. No signal. No way to call for help or check anything. Just the cold, the snow, and the endless woods all around. I packed a small bag quickly, grabbing my jacket, flashlight, and keys. I didn't want to stay here another second longer. I locked the door behind me and started walking down the path toward the truck. The snow was deep, the footprints I had seen already beginning to disappear under fresh flakes. I kept glancing behind me, heart hammering, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The walk back to the truck felt longer than it should have. The woods were silent except for the soft crunch of my boots. I reached the truck and started the engine, the heat blasting inside. I sat there for a moment, eyes on the cabin. The wind had died down, but the snow still fell thick. I drove away slowly, my mind swirling with questions. Who had been out there? Why had they come so close but never tried to enter? What had they wanted? None of it made sense. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the keys and never told anyone about the footprints. But sometimes when the wind howls just right and the snow falls heavy, I think about those footprints, about the silence outside the door, and about how, in the middle of a snowstorm, someone had been standing there, watching, but never stepping inside. We all needed a break. After months of work, stress, and city noise, my friends and I decided to rent a cabin out in the woods for the weekend. It was a small group, just 5 of us, and we figured it'd be a good way to unwind. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just the forest and each other. The place was tucked deep in the woods, a couple hours drive from the nearest town. The kind of place that feels like it's been forgotten, hidden away from the world. The cabin itself looked older than we expected. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, windows with dusty panes. There was an old wood stove inside, a dining table scratched from years of use, and a stack of firewood that looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm, and more important, it was isolated. The first day went well enough. We unpacked, set up our things, and went for a hike nearby. The forest was thick, with tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and there was a quiet stillness that felt strange but also peaceful. After dinner, we sat around a fire pit outside, drinking and telling stories under the stars. No one mentioned the eerie feeling that settled over me when I looked up at the dark tree line, but I felt it all the same, like something was watching from just beyond sight. That first night, we all crashed early. The cabin creaked as the wind blew through the trees. At first, it was comforting, the sounds of an old house settling. But as the night grew late, the noises started to feel different, more deliberate somehow. The floorboards groaned in places where no one was walking. A window rattled softly in its frame. I convinced myself it was nothing and fell asleep. The second night is when things got strange. I woke up in the middle of the night because I felt cold, even though the fire had burned low in the stove. I rubbed my arms, trying to warm up, and when I opened my eyes, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the room near the window. It wasn't clear, more like a shadow, a dark shape that didn't move or blink. It just stood there, silent, staring in my direction. My heart slammed against my ribs. I blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of the light or maybe my tired mind playing games. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I lay still for a long time, eyes wide, waiting for some sound or movement. But there was nothing except the faint creak of the cabin settling again. I didn't want to wake anyone else, so I kept quiet and eventually fell back to sleep, though my mind stayed restless. The next morning, I didn't say anything about it. I figured maybe it was just a shadow or my imagination fueled by the old cabin's atmosphere. But I noticed the others looked tired too, acting a little off. As the day passed, small things started happening. At first, it was subtle, like a misplaced book on the shelf or a chair slightly pushed away from the table. We joked about it being a prank or one of us sleepwalking, but then the odd stuff grew harder to explain. One morning, we found strange scratches on the living room wall. Thin, deep lines that looked fresh, almost clawed into the wood. None of us had done it. We all agreed because we'd been careful around the cabin, not wanting to damage anything. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, colder. No matter how many logs we threw on the stove or how many windows we opened to air it out, that chill stuck around. It wasn't like the cold from outside. It was more like the temperature dropped in patches, moving through the rooms unpredictably. At night, I found myself waking up again, listening to noises I couldn't explain. Footsteps, faint and distant, coming from the porch or the hallway. Doors that seemed to close softly on their own. Sometimes the creaking floorboards felt too close, like someone walking right next to my bed. None of us saw the shadow figure again, but the feeling never left. We started sleeping in shifts, one of us always awake to keep an eye on the cabin. On the third night, the tension was thick. No one spoke much, and when we did, our voices were low and shaky. We kept the fire stove burning late, and I stayed awake, watching the shadows dance on the walls. I went over every possible explanation in my head. Animals, branches brushing windows, the house settling, exhaustion messing with our minds. But none of it really fit all the pieces. Then, during the day, we found something in the attic. We hadn't planned to go up there. It was dark, dusty, and cramped, but someone noticed an old trunk in the corner covered in cobwebs. We pried it open, and inside was a stack of old papers and photographs, yellowed and brittle with age. One photo caught my eye right away. It was a faded black and white picture of a man standing proudly in front of the cabin. His clothes were from decades ago, maybe the 50s or 60s. He looked serious, almost grim. But behind him, in the shadows of the photo, was a dark shape, tall and vague. The shape had the same outline as the shadow figure I'd seen the night before. We passed the photo around quietly, each of us unsettled. The man was the cabin's previous owner, a fact confirmed by some old letters and documents in the trunk. The story was strange. He had disappeared without explanation years ago, leaving the cabin abandoned until it was rented again. It hit me hard. Whatever we were feeling, seeing, or experiencing wasn't some ghost story or folklore. There was something real here, something tied to the history of the cabin and that missing man. The scratches, the cold spots, the shadow. Maybe it was a person or someone who used the cabin before us. Maybe the man didn't just disappear. Maybe something happened to him, something that left a mark on the place. We packed up that night. None of us wanted to stay a moment longer. The air inside the cabin was oppressive, heavy with secrets and unspoken threats. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each lost in our thoughts about what had happened. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled on something dangerous. Not supernatural, but very real. The kind of danger that hides in silence, in shadowy corners of abandoned places, waiting for the next person to come too close. I never went back to that cabin, and if I ever hear about it again, I'll remember the photo, the dark figure standing silently behind a man who vanished without a trace, and the cold weight of something watching, just out of sight. I inherited the cabin from my late grandfather. It was a small, weather-beaten place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. My grandfather had kept it for decades, rarely visiting in his final years, but it was his home, and now it was mine. The moment I drove up the long, winding dirt road that ended at the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The air smelled of damp pine and earth. The trees around the cabin were tall and thick, their branches tangled like giant fingers reaching over the roof. The wood of the cabin was aged and gray, with patches of moss clinging to the corners. The windows were dusty and dark, hiding whatever might be inside. The first few days I spent cleaning and organizing, trying to make the place my own. The cabin had been left almost untouched since my grandfather passed, and the dust and cobwebs told stories of years spent alone. I found his old furniture, a few cracked mugs in the kitchen, and stacks of yellowed newspapers in the corner. The electricity had been shut off, so I worked mostly during daylight, using candles at night. The quiet was heavy, almost suffocating. One afternoon, I decided to explore the basement. I had never been down there before. My grandfather had always kept it locked. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet as I descended into the dim space. The basement was cold and smelled musty, filled with old tools, boxes, and broken furniture. As I moved around, my flashlight beam caught on a small door set into the far wall, almost hidden behind some crates. It was a narrow door with a rusty lock I had never noticed. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled my pocket knife from my jacket and started working on the lock, my hands trembling a little. After a few minutes, the lock gave way with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal a tiny room, no bigger than a closet. Inside was a small wooden table with a single, battered leather-bound diary resting on it. The pages were brittle and yellowed, but the writing was still clear. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, like the writer had been writing in fear or haste. The entries were dated, going back many years, and I realized this was my grandfather's diary. As I flipped through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The diary was full of terrifying stories, strange noises outside the cabin at night, the feeling of being watched, footsteps crunching through the leaves even when no one was supposed to be around. He wrote about a presence in the woods, something he called the Watcher. The entries grew darker as the weeks passed. He described hearing heavy breathing just beyond the windows, finding strange scratches on the doorframe, and once seeing tall shadows move between the trees. His handwriting became messier, his words more frantic. One of the last entries stopped me cold. Tonight, it came closer than ever before. I don't know what it is, but it watches, waits, never leaves. It knows I'm alone. I'm locking the door now, hiding this diary here. If you find it, don't open it. Don't let it inside. The final page was smudged, as if he had tried to write more, but was interrupted. There were no more entries. I sat in the dark basement, holding the diary tightly, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to leave the cabin immediately, but something made me stay. I put the diary in my backpack and locked the small door again, hoping to forget what I had read. That night, I was restless. I lay awake on the creaky bed, the cabin eerily silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the trees. Suddenly, a deep rattling sound shook the windows. It was rhythmic, like something large was moving just outside, trying to force its way in. My breath caught in my throat as the noise grew louder. Then I heard heavy footsteps thumping softly on the wooden porch, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. I pulled the blankets over my head, tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were too heavy, too slow, like a person carrying something big and heavy. I forced myself to peek out the window, holding my breath. There was nothing there. The trees were still, shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The porch was empty, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I stayed up the rest of the night, eyes glued to every window, listening to the silence that fell back over the cabin. The next morning, I found fresh scratches on the doorframe, just like my grandfather had described. The wood was torn and splintered, as if something sharp had tried to claw its way inside. I locked every door and window, making sure everything was secure, but the fear settled in deep. Over the next few days, the strange noises continued. Footsteps circling the cabin, branches snapping just beyond the edge of the clearing, and sometimes a low, guttural sound that I couldn't place. The phone had no signal here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away, so I was completely alone. I started keeping the diary close, reading it over and over for clues. My grandfather had written about signs to watch for, times when the watcher was most active, and ways he tried to keep it away. But nothing seemed to work. The watcher stayed just outside, invisible but always present. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened, I decided to face it. I went outside, flashlight in hand, and walked slowly around the cabin, calling out into the silence. The trees were still, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I found broken twigs and deep footprints in the dirt, footprints too large to be human. I didn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. The watcher was out there, somewhere, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. From then on, I kept the cabin secure and avoided going outside at night. I spent most of my time reading the diary, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The last entry haunted me. Don't let it inside. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't going to find out the hard way. Days passed, and the footsteps continued, always circling, never breaking in. I made sure all the windows were locked tight, nailed boards over the weakest ones, and kept a heavy knife by my bed. The nights were long and sleepless, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of branches snapping or the windows rattling. Then one morning, I found a gap in the boards over the back window, wide enough for something to squeeze through. I checked the rest of the cabin, but nothing else was disturbed. I felt a surge of panic, but tried to stay calm. If the watcher was trying to get in, I had to be ready. I spent the next days reinforcing every entrance and making sure I was never alone in the cabin. I kept a fire burning in the fireplace to keep warm and stayed close to the center of the house. The footsteps came every night without fail, but they never tried to break in again. Slowly, I started to piece together what my grandfather had feared. The watcher wasn't a ghost or some supernatural being. It was something real, an animal or a person living in the woods, watching the cabin, waiting for the right moment. Maybe it was a wild animal, or maybe something darker, someone who had been in those woods too long, losing their mind or worse. I realized my grandfather had been trying to protect himself from something dangerous, but couldn't explain it clearly. The warning in the diary was simple: keep it outside. Don't let it inside, no matter what. After 2 weeks, I finally felt brave enough to leave. I packed my things, locked the cabin one last time, and drove away down the long dirt road. I didn't look back. I never returned to that cabin. The memory of those nights, the heavy footsteps, the rattling windows, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me for years. I kept the diary safe, but never opened it again. Some things are better left alone. That cabin, and whatever watched from the woods, remained a dark secret of the past. Real, terrifying, and waiting quietly just beyond the trees. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth when we first set out from the cabin that morning. It was early spring, the kind of day when the sun felt warm on your face, but the forest still held the bite of winter in its shadows. We'd rented the small cabin for the weekend, hoping to get away from everything: work, city noise, the endless rush of daily life. The plan was simple: spend a few days hiking, enjoy the quiet, and maybe fish a little in the nearby creek. The trail we chose wasn't marked well on any map we had. It was supposed to be an old logging path, barely used, that wound through the thick woods behind the cabin. We thought the less traveled, the better. The silence of the forest was a comfort at first. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and the soft crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and broken twigs was the only sound besides the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. About an hour into the hike, as we climbed over a fallen tree, my girlfriend, Emily, stopped suddenly. She pointed down a narrow dirt path we hadn't seen before. It looked fresh, like it had been cleared recently, but we'd never noticed it on the way to the cabin or on any of the maps. Curious, we decided to follow it. The trail was narrow and twisted, barely wide enough for the two of us walking side by side. The ground was soft and damp, the dirt darker than the rest of the forest floor. The trees here grew closer together, their branches weaving into a tight canopy overhead that blocked most of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, almost colder than the rest of the woods. As we walked, the trail seemed to shift. At first, it was subtle, the path curved in ways it hadn't a few steps ago. I'd look ahead and swear the direction had changed when I wasn't paying attention. Emily joked that we must have wandered into some kind of natural maze. But it wasn't funny after a while. We stopped to rest beside a big rock covered in moss. The forest was too quiet here. The birds had stopped singing. The wind barely stirred the branches. Even the usual creaks of trees settling were gone. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, heavy and unnatural. We got back up and started walking again. The path wound tighter, twisting around tree trunks and snaking over roots. Every now and then, I would glance back, but the way we came from seemed to disappear behind thick bushes and brambles. It was like the forest was swallowing the trail we'd coming on. After about an hour, we suddenly saw something that made my heart pound. There was the cabin, right in front of us. The same weathered wooden porch, the chipped paint on the door. Relief washed over me like a wave. We had been out long enough that I was starting to feel the edge of panic creeping in. But when we looked behind us, the forest wasn't the same anymore. The trees were taller, darker, and much thicker. The path that should have led back to the trailhead was gone, swallowed by undergrowth and tangled branches. The woods behind the cabin looked wild and untouched, not the familiar clearing we'd known. Emily said nothing. I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We walked inside the cabin and locked the door behind us, the sound echoing loud in the quiet room. The cabin felt smaller somehow. The shadows seemed deeper in the corners, and the familiar creaks of the wooden floorboards were louder, like they wanted to remind us we weren't alone. We sat in the living room, the window facing the dark woods behind the cabin. Neither of us wanted to admit how strange everything felt. That night, I woke up to a noise, soft footsteps pacing outside the cabin. Slow, steady, moving back and forth. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some stray dog sniffing around. But as the footsteps circled the cabin's perimeter, something about the rhythm felt deliberate, almost like someone was walking just to be heard. I got up quietly and peeked through the window. The porch light cast a small yellow pool on the ground, but there was nothing out there. The woods looked black and empty, but the sound didn't stop. It kept pacing, slow and steady. I went outside, stepping carefully onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap. The footsteps stopped immediately, swallowed by the silence. I walked around the cabin once, shining my phone's flashlight into the shadows, but I didn't see anything. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing that would explain the sound. I went back inside and locked the door again, my heart pounding. Emily was awake, watching me with wide eyes. We tried to sleep, but the feeling that we were being watched lingered. Every small noise made me jump, and I was constantly checking the windows. The next morning, we decided to go into the nearby town. We needed answers, or at least some kind of explanation. The locals were quiet when we asked about the woods near the cabin. No one spoke much, and the few who did warned us not to wander off any marked trails. One man, older with deep lines on his face, finally told us about an old trail that ran near the cabin. It was said to be cursed, a place where people sometimes vanished without a trace. He didn't say much more, just that it was better not to go near it. We left the town quickly after that. Back at the cabin, the forest still felt wrong. The thick, unfamiliar woods behind the cabin didn't change. We packed up and left as soon as we could, driving away with the windows rolled up tight. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder what happened to that path, how it could lead us in a circle, trapping us in a loop we couldn't see. And I wonder if those footsteps pacing outside were just someone else lost, trying to find their way back. But the truth is, we never want to find out. I set off early in the afternoon, my backpack heavy but manageable, the dog trailing close behind. I've been looking forward to this trip for months, Just me, my dog, and a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods. The place was famous for its crystal clear view of the night sky, miles away from city lights and noise. The owner had told me the stars were something else, so bright and close it felt like you could reach out and touch them. I didn't need much else, just some peace and quiet, the dog's company, and the endless dark above. The walk to the cabin wasn't long, but it was rough. The trail wound through thick trees, the kind that block out the sun even on a bright day. The forest floor was littered with pine needles and broken branches, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. The dog's paws made soft crunching sounds on the path as she sniffed around, alert and excited. I kept glancing up through the gaps in the trees, trying to catch a hint of the open sky ahead. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood quiet and still against the edge of the forest. It was small but sturdy, made of weathered logs with a steep metal roof that looked like it had seen a few harsh winters. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a couple of old wooden chairs that looked perfect for sitting and staring up at the stars. There was no electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials. A wood stove inside, a water jug, and a little propane stove for cooking. Exactly what I wanted. I set my pack down and unlocked the door, the hinges creaking softly. The dog patted inside and immediately settled down on the floor, sniffing everything like it was new and strange. I unpacked some food, filled a water bowl, and made a quick fire in the stove. The cabin was warm in no time, and the wood crackled softly. I lit a lantern and sat down at the small table to eat. The first night passed quietly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I caught glimpses of stars through the small windows. The dog stayed close, curled up beside my feet, and everything felt safe in that little cabin at the edge of the forest. The second day was mostly the same, quiet, peaceful. I spent most of it reading and wandering the clearing with the dog, who seemed happy enough but a little restless. By late afternoon, I started getting ready for the evening. The sun dipped low, and the sky began turning soft shades of pink and orange. I carried a folding chair onto the porch and sat down, the dog beside me, as the first stars began to twinkle. The night sky was incredible. The stars were so clear, it was almost like looking at a giant black map filled with tiny white dots. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a thick smear of silver dust. I pointed out constellations to myself, feeling a little silly but content. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. After a while, though, I noticed something strange. It was the feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off at first. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild in the silence. But every time I glanced toward the edge of the forest, I caught a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. Bright, steady, and too large to be any small animal I knew. I looked away quickly and blinked, but when I looked back, the eyes were still there. Just blinking slowly, watching. Not moving, just fixed on me through the darkness. I froze. The dog growled low in her throat, standing up and staring hard at the same spot. She didn't bark or run, just growled and bristled, the kind of growl that meant serious trouble. My heart pounded, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I tried to convince myself it was probably a deer or some other wild animal, just caught in the moonlight. But the eyes were too close and too focused, and every time I turned my head to look directly, they disappeared, just blackness where the trees were thick. I didn't dare get up from the porch. The dog stayed, glued to my side, her fur bristling, growling at the edge of the forest all night. I shut the cabin door and windows, locking every latch I could find. But still, the growling didn't stop. Every few minutes, she would dart to the door, sniffing the air, teeth bared. I sat in the corner with a lantern, the small circle of light doing little to push back the shadows around the cabin. I wasn't sleeping, not really, just sitting with my eyes half closed, waiting for dawn. When the first light finally crept through the trees, I stood up and moved to the door. The dog stayed close behind me, still tense, eyes flicking nervously toward the forest. That's when I saw it. Deep, angry scratch marks covered the entire outside of the cabin. Long gouges in the wood, some nearly a foot deep, stretching all the way around. It looked like something huge had tried to claw its way in, desperate to get inside. The marks were fresh, the wood splintered and rough to the touch. There were no footprints around the clearing, just broken branches and crushed grass where the creature had circled the cabin. I could still smell the wetness of the forest on the bark, something alive and wild. I stared at the marks for a long time, running my hands over the jagged edges. The dog whimpered and backed away, sitting down with her tail tucked tight. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The thought of what had been out there, watching me all night, scratching at the door. It made me realize just how close I had been to danger, and how lucky I was to still be standing there alive. I didn't wait another minute. I packed my things quickly, the dog pulling at the leash like she knew it was time to leave. The sky was already brightening, and I wanted to get back to the trailhead before the sun was too high. I didn't look back as I walked away, the sound of my boots on the dirt trail pounding in my ears. When I finally reached my car hours later, I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing hard. The cabin faded into the distance behind me, swallowed by the trees. I never went back. That cabin and its perfect night sky were something I wanted to remember only as a place of peace. But the scratches and the glowing eyes in the dark, the feeling of being hunted, reminded me that some quiet places are quiet for a reason. Sometimes the wild isn't just nature. Sometimes it's something watching you, waiting just beyond the light. And no matter how clear the stars are above, the darkness around you can still hide things better than you'd ever want to know.